Chronicles of the War of Souls book series. Book 1 Valeria, The Beginning of the End. Chapter 10. Wings and Blood. The next day, when the sun rose over the steppe, flooding the boundless, gray plains with an even, cold light, the small company resumed their journey. They walked slowly, their footsteps quiet and weary. They spoke in whispers, as if afraid to disturb the fragile silence that had settled over the steppe after the night. They spoke of Lundorn, and their words were filled with a poignant, bright sadness, as though they were remembering not merely a home, but a dream seen long ago and lost forever. They remember how sunbeams, piercing the emerald canopy of the eternal forest, tainted patterns of light and shadow on the soft moss. They recalled the sweet, intoxicating taste of nectar from night-blooming flowers that opened in the singers' gardens, only once a century, filling the air with an aroma that made heads spin and hearts falter. Each memory was like touching something infinitely precious and irrevocably gone. A home that might never be the same again. A place they might be fated never to return to. It was then, in the midst of one of these quiet, pensive conversations, that a large, swift shadow slid across the ground beside them, racing over the withered grass and the stones illuminated by the morning sun. As one, they looked up and fell silent. And what showed in their eyes was not so much fear as a kind of stupor, as if the steppe itself had held its breath from the clear, cloudless sky, as if they were the very embodiment of unattainable freedom. A flock of hippogriffs descended, smooth and silent. The creatures were majestic and beautiful in their wild, primordial essence. The front halves of their bodies, with powerful, broad wings and heads of proud eagles whose golden amber eyes glittered coldly and sharply in the morning light, merged with the sturdy, muscular hindquarters of noble steeds. Their plumage, the color of old, darkened bronze and reddish copper, with dark hawk-like stripes on their long flight feathers, shimmered and played in the sun with 1,000 hues from deep, almost black umber to a reddish-golden glow at the tips. They soared in the thin air with such innate grace that it seemed the very element of wind carried them obediently. Not they who cleaved it with their wings. Each winged was full not of force, but of a natural, indisputable dominion over the heights. The flock, numbering about a dozen, descended smoothly, like a falling leaf, onto a green patch of steppe nearby, to graze on the lush grass miraculously preserved in this secluded hollow, at the very foot of the ridge. Their movements were full of natural dignity, even bending to the earth to pluck a tuft of grass. They looked regal and eternal, guardians of these boundless expanses. Each step of their powerful hooves was measured. Each turn of their eagle heads was filled with calm assurance. The elves stood transfixed, spellbound by the unexpected sight, forgetting for a moment their weariness and anxieties. Between their kind and the hippogriffs, there had always existed a silent, mutual respect. Both races understood the ancient language of the wind and valued freedom boundlessly, though they expressed it differently, one in their mournful farisons and swift, silent running, the other in a single mighty wingbeat that carried them to the very clouds. "Look," whispered Iviel softly, with bated breath, and her voice held a pure, childlike wonder, for the first time in many days devoid of its usual bitterness and fear. "Children of sky and earth, it is as if the lost harmony of the world has briefly revealed itself to us in this place." The leader of the flock, a larger, darker hippogriff with silver scars on his eagle leg, lifted his proud head and fixed his piercing, all-seeing gaze on the small group of elves. In his huge amber eyes there was no shadow of threat, no trace of fear, only calm, serene appraisal and a curiosity as cold and clear as a mountain lake. He uttered a short, guttural cry, resembling both an eagle's shriek and a brief equine snort, a sound full of wild strength and boundless freedom, tearing from the very depths of his bestial throat. Lirael slowly, very smoothly raised her hand, palm open, in an ancient elven gesture known to few, signifying peace and a complete lack of ill intent. She did not utter a single word, knowing full well that the true language of hippogriffs was one of actions, posture, and gaze, not empty speeches. Her own face was calm, but deep within her green eyes lay a tense expectancy. The leader watched them for one more long moment, then, as if satisfied with what he saw, calmly lowered his head to the lush grass once more. The rest of the flock obediently followed his example, but several young, curious hippogriffs continued to glance furtively, with genuine interest, at the strange, silent travelers, their eyes gleaming with an intelligent, almost human curiosity. Lirael stood motionless for a moment, watching the majestic, impassive creatures. And then a thought, born of long desperation and cruel necessity, crystallized into a clear, reckless decision. Their daily trek on foot held a multitude of invisible dangers and wasted precious time. Time the world might no longer have. She felt this loss with every cell of her weary body. "Everyone, stay here," she said quietly, up with iron command over her shoulder to her companions. "And do not make a single sudden move. Do not startle them." Taking a deep, calming breath, she slowly, smoothly, almost silently stepped towards the grazing flock. Her gaze was fixed on the massive figure of the leader. She walked with her hands held strictly at her sides, palms outward, again and again demonstrating the complete absence of weapons and ill intent. Her own elven grace seemed to find an echo in the dignity of these wild creatures. She moved not like a hunter stalking prey, but as part of the same ancient world as they, like a shadow from a cloud sliding across the earth. The leader raised his head again when she was within a few dozen paces. His golden, molten amber eyes narrowed, but he showed no trace of aggression, only watched, immobile and majestic as the stone mountain behind him. The air around seemed to freeze, to thicken, and only the quiet rustle of grass under her careful feet broke the ringing silence. It seemed the very step held its breath, awaiting the outcome of this silent meeting between children of the forest and children of the sky. Lyrael stopped at a respectful, sensible distance, where her presence did not violate the personal space of the majestic creature. She did not bow. Such a show of submission could be misinterpreted by the proud offspring of sky and earth as weakness or deceit. Instead, she slowly, as in a ritual, raised her hand, fingers unclenched, and softly touched it to her own heart, feeling the steady, quickened beat of life beneath her palm. Then, just as smoothly, almost tenderly, she pointed at him, the leader, tracing an invisible but palpable arc in the air. This silent gesture spoke clearer than any words. "I come in peace, from heart to heart. My truth is here, within, and I see you." Then she began to speak. Her voice was quiet, melodic, but deliberately stripped of the usual elven lilt. It sounded like the steady rustle of leaves in the wind, carrying an important, urgent message, without adornment or superfluous sound. Every word was measured, like an arrow before the shot. "Keepers of the high skies and the green valleys," she began, and her words seemed to dissolve in the very wind, addressing not only the leader, but the entire flock around, this whole place, the steppe itself listening to her. "We are but travelers from distant Lindorn, and our long road lies far to the east, not for conquest or gain, not for another's wealth. We go to the place where the very sky cast out one of its ancient, eternal stars." She made a small but expressive pause, allowing them to feel the weight and bitterness of her words with their entire being, letting the heaviness of this loss penetrate their consciousness. The silence around grew even deeper. Its fall was not just a sign or an omen. It was a silent cry of despair. "The whole world is sick. Can you feel it? The darkness we all sense with our very skin grows with each day. It threatens not only our forests or your skypaths. It threatens the very spirit of this world, the fragile balance which you, children of both sky and earth, embody better than any other beings. You are the very harmony of the elements, and that harmony is under threat." Lyrael turned, and her hand, thin and crisscrossed with small scratches from the long journey, from thickets and sharp stones, stretched out to the east, where the sky thickened to the color of old, tarnished lead, heavy and joyless. "We need to reach that place." Her voice sounded hoarse from weariness and strain, but held not a shadow of doubt. "Not in months of trudging on foot, taking our way through lands full of shadows and strange, unfriendly eyes hiding in thickets and ravines. We need to get there now, this very moment, before the black seal is set upon all living things for good, before it is too late. And so, I call upon you. I ask for your aid. I ask for your wings." She raised her gaze, her pale face turned to the leader, and in her green, forest-deep eyes burned not a plea, but that hard-won resolve born on the brink of ruin. When despair crystallizes into steel wool, and with it a desperate hope, fragile as the first morning ice on a puddle, thin and transparent, but unextinguished, clinging to the very edge, carry us east, to the place where the light went out, as if someone blew out the single candle in a bottomless night. Help us understand what is happening, and perhaps, to find a means against this darkness that creeps over the land, choking the grasses and frightening the birds. Not for our sake, lost in these parts, for the sky, in whose heights you soar, for the earth, upon which you tread with heavy hooves, for the free wind itself, which may fall silent forever, leaving behind only dead, stagnant air where there will be neither flight nor song. The hippogriff leader listened without moving. His mighty muscles were tensed under the layer of feathers and short, dense fur, every vein in his neck standing out beneath the skin. His eagle gaze, yellow and piercing, devoid of the warmth of human feeling but full of bottomless, ancient wisdom, was fixed on Lyriel. It seemed he was weighing not so much her words as the very essence of her soul, the timbre of her voice, sounding like a taut string ready to either snap or ring pure the straightness of her stance, unbent by fear the purity of her intent, felt on some bestial, ancient level inaccessible to reason, a clear to instinct. The air trembled with tension, thick as resin, heavy as a pre-storm sky. The elves, holding their breath, watched from a distance, and in their hearts lived the fear that one clumsy movement, one accidental rustle, the crunch of a twig underfoot, would startle this fragile moment of trust forged from desperation and will. Even the steppe wind, the eternal wanderer, seemed to still, listening to the silence that had fallen between them, not daring to disturb this silent tribunal. Finally, the hippogriff slowly, with unearthly grandeur, inclined his eagle head, crowned with a crest of stiff, dark feathers. It was not a nod of agreement, but rather a gesture of deepest acknowledgement. I hear you, I see you, I have felt the weight of your burden. He made a short, guttural sound, like smooth pebbles tumbling in a mountain stream, softer than the previous one but no less commanding. Several other hippogriffs from the flock raised their heads from the grass, looking attentively at their leader with eyes bright as polished amber, in which the last of the sun was reflected. Then he did something Lyriel had not expected at all. He turned away from her and slowly, with the imperturbable calm of a strength that needs no haste, strode towards the group of elves. His powerful equine hooves, covered with fine chips and scratches from stones and battles, stepped soundlessly on the trampled grass, leaving deep but neat impressions, like imprints of an ancient seal. The elves instinctively recoiled and froze in place, heeding Lyriel's unseen command, standing in respectful but tense postures, ready to leap aside at any moment but unwilling to show weakness. The hippogriff circled them, his heavy, measured breathing audible in the ensuing silence, steam from his nostrils swirling in the cold air. His amber eyes, cold and all-seeing, slid over each face, lingering on the rough, already faded bandage binding Sineel's arm, on the healing, crimson scar crossing Alir's powerful thigh, on the weary, doused, and sweat-stained but firm, unconquered features of Halder, upon which each wrinkle told its own story. He sniffed the air with his beak, as if trying to catch and dissect the smell of their long journey, the acrid, clinging smell of distant fires, the coppery, sweetish tang of spilled and dry blood, the damp, moldy spirit of the dungeons they had traversed, and the unyielding, cold will that emanated from them like heat from scorched stones even when the fire was gone. This was a test, a judgment not on words, but on blood and grime, on the authenticity of scars and weariness. He was assessing whether these strangers, reeking of pain and stubbornness, were worthy of his free flock's aid, or were they just another group of vagrants seeking to use the strength of others? Having finished his silent circuit, he returned to Lyriel and stared at her again with his unblinking, hypnotic gaze, in which there was now not only curiosity, but a certain decision maturing in the depths. Then he sharply, with a loud rustle like the unfurling of a huge war banner, beat his powerful wings. The movement was so strong it raised a cloud of dust and tiny grass blades, forcing the steppe carpet to bow to the very earth, and the elves to shield their eyes. He issued a series of short, sharp cries, akin to battle calls, devoid of aggression. They were clear, imperative sounds directed at his flock. In response, the other hippogriffs, as if understanding the invisible command, began to approach. They were not friendly, no warmth or welcome shone in their eyes, but in their precise, measured, synchronous movements could be read the readiness of warriors accustomed to discipline and silent obedience. They lined up in pairs, settling to the ground with a soft, elastic movement, slightly bending their front, scaly, tough-skinned eagle legs to ease the riders mounting. Their mighty wings folded with a quiet, velvety rustle, feather to feather. The leader looked at Lyriel once more and gave a short, almost imperious nod of his massive head towards the nearest pair of hippogriffs. The invitation was as clear as the blast of a horn sounding in silence before battle. It was not clothed in words, but it was understood more clearly than any blood-sworn oath. They were agreeing. They were gifting them their wings. Lyriel turned to her companions. In her eyes, for the first time in many, endless days filled with road dust, one pain, and the shadow of unrelenting threat, there flared not just a glimmer of hope, but a real, living flame. It burned deep in the green depth of her gaze, fierce and cleansing, capable of melting the ice of despair that had bound their hearts. This was not a reflection, but the very flame warm, quivering, and unstoppable. "Come," she said simply, and in that one word, short and clear, was the crystalline, pure chime of a new fate, light as the stroke of a wing on air, and inexorable as a falling stone. "The sky awaits us." The elves' hearts beat in unison with the mighty wings ready to lift into the air. Their chests heaved, catching the thin wind of the impending flight, still carrying the smells of earth but already promising a different, cold freshness of the heights. Slowly, trying not to make a single sudden movement, as if approaching a sleeping dragon whose slumber was light and fraught with sudden awakening, they approached the hippogriffs. The majestic creatures stood motionless, like statues cast of bronze and gold. Only their golden eyes, full of ancient knowledge and serene calm of strength, followed every movement, every cautious step, every restrained sigh. It seemed they saw not only the bodies, but the very souls of these weary travelers, weighing their resolve and their fear. Lyrael was the first to approach the leader, and her legs buckled from weariness, muscles trembling from long strain, but her will remained untouched. He was the largest, and his back seemed wide and reliable as a cliff in a stormy sea, able to withstand any tempest. She cautiously, almost reverently, placed a hand on his feathered neck, feeling under her fingers the firm, steely muscles hidden beneath velvety, warm feathers, and that living, pulsing warmth of might hidden in his veins, like smoldering fire. The hippogriff did not flinch, did not pull away, only slightly turned his eagle head, and his dark eye, gleaming like wet amber, stared at her, as if giving silent, final permission. With the innate grace of her kind, she nimbly mounted his back, settling behind the mighty, folded wings, and her fingers dug into the thick mane, resembling both feathers and fur, rough and alive, smelling of wind, sun, and wild freedom. One by one, slowly and not without fear, a chill in their bellies and throats tight, the others followed. Aylar, with his powerful, young-oak physique, chose the sturdiest hippogriff, whose shoulders and flanks were covered with a network of old, white scars mute chronicles of past fights. Iviel, light and slender as a reed in the wind, settled on the back of a more slender one, with feathers the color of old, noble silver tinged with a pale bluish sheen in the light. Halder, muttering something about his bones being too old and dry for such mad leaps into the sky, and that the earth was the only fitting and honorable place for a gray-haired warrior, nevertheless, with Fëanor's help, climbed onto his mount. His face was pale, but his lips, etched with wrinkles, pressed into a thin, resolute line speaking of a will stronger than bodily frailty. Even Cyneal, still weak and pale as linen, was seated with motherly care by Rinael before her, and she embraced him with one arm, pressing him to herself, to her warm, protective chest, while with the other, strong and sure, she gripped the resilient feather of the hippogriff, holding onto it like an anchor in this new, frightening aerial world. When the last elf had found his place, the leader, feeling the new, alien weight upon his back, let out a piercing, summoning cry, a sound tearing from the very depths of his bestial throat. From those secret places where an eagle's scream and a stallion's whinny are born. In response, the entire flock cried out as one, as if by an invisible command. It was a sound that made blood run cold and shivers race down the spine, wild, ancient, full of unbreakable strength, born in times when the world was young and full of wonders, and the sky was closer to the earth, a sound before which all fears and doubts paled. And then, with one powerful, unified beat of a dozen pairs of wings, raising a whirlwind of dust and tearing dry blades of grass from the ground, they tore themselves from the earth. The sensation was so sudden and complete that a stifled gasp escaped several elves. There was no support anymore, only air. The wind, which had been merely a companion before, gentle and predictable, now assailed them with all its furious, untamed might. It howled in their ears with a deafening, mad symphony, tore at their hair, knotting it, made their eyes water and chilled their skin, penetrating through the densest fabrics. The earth beneath them swam away, rapidly receding and turning into an endless, living tapestry woven from brown, gold, and green patches of forests, fields, and wastelands, stitched with silver threads of rivers and streams. The Dragon's Ridge, huge and impassable, the mountain sentinel, before which they had so long stood in awe, hiding in its shadow and clambering up its slopes, suddenly seemed merely a fold, a wrinkle on the giant body of the world, something large but no longer all-consuming. They rose higher and higher, piercing layers of air, and with each second the world unfolded before them in all its breathtaking, incomprehensible scale, making hearts falter from this sudden, staggering grandeur. For the elves, children of the forest, born in the shadow of ancient trees and accustomed to reliable, solid ground underfoot and the cozy, protective arch of branches overhead, this flight was both terrifying and sublime, intoxicating and soul-chilling. They were flying, not on a magical ship from songs, not with the aid of levitating spells that were merely the mind's play with nature, but on the backs of living, breathing creatures whose hearts beat in unison with the wind's roar, granting them the greatest, forbidden freedom, the freedom of the sky, bottomless and boundless, where there are no paths, no barriers, only will and strength. And in this dizzying flight, in this deafening roar of the elements, for a moment the gnawing pain of old wounds, the bone-deep weariness, and the oppressive, clinging fear of what lay ahead were forgotten. All that remained was pure, primordial wonder, born in the very heart, inexplicable and all-consuming, and a fragile, incredible, like the first ray after a storm piercing torn clouds, hope that they would be in time, that not all was yet lost, that somewhere ahead lay not only darkness, but also a chance. They flew, subject only to the will of the hippogriffs and the flow of invisible air currents, mighty streams and eddies that for ages had carried birds south, themselves part of this ancient, incomprehensible navigation. The gigantic wall of the Dragon's Ridge slowly drifted by on the left, eternal and silent in its stone muteness, while beneath them, like a living, breathing map, stretched the land, living its own, separate, bustling and unfamiliar life, a life that went on its own way, unaware of their desperate mission. From the height of a bird's flight, the world seemed different, vast, immense, frightening in its size, yet surprisingly ordered, obeying an invisible but ironclad order. They saw villages clinging to the foot of the ridge like swallows' nests molded from clay, straw, and human labor. Tiny, from a height of several hundred feet, houses with dark, blind spots for windows, winding paths between them like gray, tangled spiderwebs. They made out microscopic figures of people bustling between houses and fields, like ants in a giant anthill, occupied with their small, great affairs. One figure, hunched under an invisible burden, dragged a bundle of firewood. Another, waving a phantom stick, drove tiny, moving dots that were livestock to water. A third, quite small like a bug, ran along a dusty street, raising a tiny, pitiful cloud of dust in its wake. From this height, it did not look like chaos or meaningless bustle. It was a complex, measured, centuries-honed dance of existence, its rhythm beaten not by drums, but by the change of seasons, sunrises and sunsets, the ticking of a heart, and the silence of a final breath, a dance in which they, elves on hippogriff back, were but a fleeting shadow passing over the stage, unnoticed by the dancers. Past them, with cheerful, carefree chirping, flew flocks of bird skylarks rising in a spiral towards the dazzling, cold sun, or a strict, disciplined wedge of migratory ducks stretching southward in an even formation, heeding an ancient, inexorable call. They seemed unaware they were rushing alongside heralds of a coming storm, those upon whose shoulders lay the burden of the world's possible doom. Their world, simple and clear, honest in its immediacy, was limited to sky, earth, and the call of instinct to find food, build a nest, flee the cold. Nothing in this peaceful, lulling picture unfolding beneath them like an endless, serene tapestry foretold disaster, cried out of an impending end. Smoke, rising in thin, almost transparent streams from the chimneys of low, squat houses, was the smoke of hearths and stoves, smelling of bread, burning resin, and the warmth of home, not the acrid, suffocating stench of conflagrations. The fields, visible as neat, geometric patches, were divided into even plots by dark lines of boundaries, not trampled into a muddy mash by the hooves of war horses, not watered with blood and strewn with bodies, that from this height would have seemed mere dark splinters. From the height of their swift, almost weightless flight, the empire of Almar, even on its most remote, forgotten fringes, looked alive, breathing, immersed in its daily, eternal and so familiar cares, its imperceptible yet stubborn, measured labor. There was no sign of marching columns like iron, soulless worms in armor glittering in the sun, no ominous, greasy pillars of smoke on the horizon, no black, death and despair banners flapping in the wind, only the earth, laboring for itself, quiet and fertile, and the sky, indifferent and serene towards its small, bustling labors and great, unknown anxieties. In this soul-rending contrast between their own unbearably heavy mission, smelling of ash, sweat, and the iron taste of death, and that serene, age-rooted, calm life bubbling and boiling below, in its simple beauty lay a special, aching, dull pain of sadness. They carried with them, like plague-ridden yet doomed messengers, news of the inevitable end of this fragile, naive idol, of a crack that had gone not only through the heartwood of the white tree, once exuding pure light, but perhaps through the very invisible, finest fabric of this world, woven from time, memory, and quiet hopes. And below, in their blind and touching, almost childlike simplicity, the people, these small, fragile beings with their short, flash-like fates, continued to plow the dry but still native earth, so grain into it with prayer, and raise children laughing on thresholds, unaware that the very sky, under whose endless vault they lived their busy, occupied lives, had already cracked, like a thin, almost invisible cobweb on glass, and that 10 elves, lost in the endless, indifferent blue, on the backs of proud, silent hippogriffs, were rushing through their sleeping, unknowing world, trying to patch a black, yawning hole in the very fabric of reality before that hole gaped wide and swallowed all they knew, loved, and served day after day without complaint. Disaster, as often happens in the chronicles of fate, where the most terrible pages begin with the most peaceful lines, crept up unnoticed, hiding behind the back of a clear, calm day, using the very serenity as cover. They flew in ringing, crystalline silence of their own thoughts and the detachment that had settled upon them, broken only by the monotonous, insistent whistle of wind in their ears and the measured, powerful, lulling beats of their noble steeds' wings, whose elongated, blurred shadows, like dark ghosts, slid over the ground below, racing across hills and valleys. The world spread out beneath them seemed frozen in serene tranquility, in a deep, almost intoxicating sleep of well-being. And it was in this moment, when their hearts had begun to thaw from the icy, gripping fear, when something like forgotten calm stirred in their breasts from behind the sharp, saw-toothed peaks of the Dragon's Ridge. Like a cloud of locusts, black, dense, and relentless, a flock erupted. These were not migratory birds, not harmless, nosy skeins of ducks. These were harpies. Dozens, and then, to their boundless horror, hundreds of winged figures with bodies resembling emaciated, desiccated, twisted women worked by hunger and malice, and the wings of predatory, loathsome birds, covered in dirty brown and earthy gray feathers merging with the color of the cliffs. They burst from the deepest crevices from which they had risen, as if the mountain itself had vomited them from its stone belly. In the air, once clean, ringing, and icy, hung a piercing, soul-freezing, eardrum-rending screech, not a song, but a cacophony of pure, undiluted hunger and blind fury. Their infamous, terrifying battle cry that froze blood in veins and clenched guts into a tight, painful knot. Their yellow, narrow, slit-like eyes, devoid of any glimmer of reason, compassion, or even simple animal curiosity, were fixed on the flock of hippogriffs, rare, satisfying, fat, and desired prey that had suddenly appeared in their hunting grounds. To fight began instantly, without challenge, without warning, like a lightning flash in a clear, cloudless day. Suddenly, blindingly, and lethally, the harpies, light, agile, and unnaturally fast, like starved dogs unleashed, fell upon the hippogriffs with mute, concentrated fury. They tried to surround them in a dense, prickly ring, cut each off from the flock, isolate and overwhelm with numbers, and sink their razor-sharp, curved claws into the vulnerable, membranous wings and muscular backs of the winged horses. The air filled with hoarse, cawing, inhuman cries, the whistle of air sliced by claws and bodies, and the formidable, deep, full of rage roar of hippogriffs sensing an enemy and ready to fight back. The leader under Liriel, mighty and experienced, sensing the deadly, long-familiar threat, issued a short, abrupt, but incredibly powerful guttural howl, calling the flock to defense, to immediate, ironclad cohesion. The noble creatures, a minute ago soaring in peace and serenity, transformed in an instant, trading grace for fury. They closed ranks, wing to wing, almost touching each other, becoming a living, flying fortress of flesh, feathers, and cold, calculated rage. Their powerful, sickle-curved beaks and talon-armed legs, capable of tearing steel armor and shattering bone, became formidable and merciless weapons in a heartbeat. Lear's hippogriff, the mighty horse eagle, roaring from the depths of its chest, met a harpy diving at it with open claws with a crushing, precise strike of a taloned paw. The blow landed on the chest, a dull crunch sounded, and the creature, with tufts of feathers and an ear splitting, full of pain and fury screech, was flung away, tumbling helplessly in the air. But there were too many harpies. They kept appearing from behind dark rocks again and again. Like spawn of darkness itself, endless and relentless, they attacked with a fierce, almost insane, tireless rage, knowing no fear and no mercy, driven only by hunger and thirst for slaughter. One of them, slipping low under the belly of Iviel's hippogriff, dug long, bony, blew from cold fingers into its broad wing, trying to snap the thin but steel-strong bones. To disable it, another, making a flexible, almost unnatural, serpentine dive, broke through the chaos to Fenrir and rained a hail of furious blows on him with its clawed, scab and filth-covered feet, nearly knocking the elf from the dizzying, lethal height down to the merciless, hard ground far below. The elves, stunned by the screeching and blinded by the fury of the sudden battle, did not falter, for their long, hardship-filled journey had tempered not only their bodies, but their spirit, turning fear into cold focus. Their bows, elegant, supple, and deadly extensions of themselves, were in their hands instantly, the movement automatic. Thin, straight arrows, loosed from the swaying, dancing backs of hippogriffs in the air currents, found their targets almost without miss. Harpies fell with piercing, abruptly cut off death cries, leaving behind short, scarlet, dissipating trails in the thin air. It was chaos, blind, furious, and all-consuming, a mad dance on the very edge of the sky, where partners were life and death, feathers, white and black, clean and filthy, wild, inhuman shrieks, the whistle of arrows slicing air, and the heavy, coppery, cloying smell of fresh blood mingled into a single, blinding, deafening whirlwind. The carefree flight, granting but a moment of hope and oblivion, had turned into a desperate, exhausting struggle for survival high above an indifferent, calm earth, where any mistake, any delayed, the slightest loss of balance meant immediate, inescapable fall and instant, useless death. The ambush, sudden and merciless, had put the proud hippogriffs at a disadvantageous, unnatural, and humiliating position. Their main strength, swiftness, lightning maneuverability, the possibility of a crushing, irresistible attack from a dizzying dive or a quick, thought-fast escape from any pursuit was shackled, as if by invisible but strongest chains. On their backs were fragile, vulnerable beings, the elves, whom they, by the call of ancient blood and silent honor, had taken under their protection, accepting the burden of another's fate. A sharp, virtuosic turn, a wing-over, a swift, almost vertical dive. Any of their favorite, centuries-perfected aerial combat techniques now carried a lethal threat not only to the harpies, but to their riders, who had entrusted them with their lives. In a desperate surge of hope, they were forced to fight in a tight, constricting, unnatural formation, almost in place, fending off a whole swarm of ferocious, tireless predators that pressed from all sides like gnats, swarmed underbellies, and clung to tails. Their mighty, perfect wings, made to cover miles with a single elastic, powerful stroke, now worked with short, sharp, exhausting beats just to hold position in the unsettled, screech-torn air and parry countless, blinding blows, beaks and talons, capable of tearing a wolf in half, crushing bone, and rending steel. Now acted with caution, with calculated, almost surgical precision, so as not to accidentally strike, not to catch the elf desperately clinging to their back, whose body had become both precious cargo and a deadly hindrance. Lyriel felt this with every cell of her body, every tense fiber, every nerve trembling like a string. The heavy, almost tangible, pressing burden of despair hanging in the air, thick with down, feathers, acrid sweat, and the coppery, Swedish smell of fear and blood. Her hippogriff, the leader, majestic and now doomed, was caught in a trap of his unnobility. Like a regal lion, entangled in nets woven from his own mane, he thrashed in the very center of the flock, beating off attacks now with his beak, now with a wing. His muscular, broad chest, covered with silver scars of past victories, now streaked with fresh, crimson gashes and scratches, and each lunged towards a potential gap where he could break out and gain altitude, was immediately curbed by his own will. He could not abandon his kin. These winged brothers locked in a common death struggle, and he could not risk her, his rider, whose physical weight on his back was now negligible compared to the moral weight, the burden of responsibility for her life. He issued furious, guttural, hoarse cries, full of savage anger and bitter, piercing awareness of his temporary unfreedom, but his wings, these magnificent, bronze wings that had once furrowed the bottomless cloud expanses, were bound by invisible but strongest fetters of duty and honor, heavier than any iron chains. The elves, understanding this with the piercing, burning clarity that comes only on the very brink of death, fought with redoubled, almost desperate, blind fury. Their arrows, drawn from quivers with smooth, automatic, almost instinctive motions, flew unerringly, creating around each hippogriff a lethal, whizzing palisade, a mobile wall of wood and steel. Aylar, his usually calm, impassive face now contorted with extreme strain, unable to shoot effectively from a bow on such an unsteady, dancing perch where the whole world tumbled in a mad whirl of feathers, claws, and cries, dared his long, straight blade, and the cold, true metal sang in his experienced hand, slicing off the tenacious, bony hands that reach for the bulging veins on his mount's neck, for the vulnerable throat. Fener and Lariel, working in a coordinated, honed pair, shot almost point-blank, from a distance of a few feet, and the bowstrings hummed like swarms of angry, deadly wasps, and arrows thudded wetly into feathered flesh. That they were merely passengers in this battle, elf children, in this ancient war between sky and its underbelly, between free flight and clinging, insatiable carrion. The true weight of the fight, all its leaden, suffocating mass, lay upon the hippogriffs, on their resilient, trembling with strained muscles and mighty, tiring wings. And with each minute, marked by the rapid, loud beating of Lirel's heart, it became clear they could not hold out long like this. The harpy flock did not thin their wild, blind, mindless fury, fueled by an ancient, primal hatred for all that is noble and free, knew no limit or satiation, and they kept emerging from the very heights, from behind peaks, like black, countless spawn of a stormy, poisonous cloud. And the winged horses, burdened with the weight of riders and forced to fight not in their favored eagle style, the style of masters of the skies, but in the style of cornered vultures defending a spot, were gradually, inexorably tiring. Their movements, once so swift a human eye could barely follow, lost their former, bird-like lightness, and mighty wings, whose beats birthed wind and hurricane, beat heavier and heavier, as if invisible lead weights had clung to each feather. They were still a formidable, fearsome force, but their forced, humiliating defensive tactic, this useless circling around themselves, slowly but surely, with the inevitability of a stone falling into an abyss, was leading them to inevitable death in the very heavens that had always been their kingdom, their element, their only and true home. The whirlwind of feathers, piercing cries, and mute, universal pain tightened around them like a steel ring, and Liriel felt her hippogriff beneath her beginning to breathe heavily, hoarsely, spasmodically, his powerful sides heaving, and his magnificent wings, repeatedly grazed by the razor-sharp claws of harpies, leaving bloody, sticky tracks on the golden, bronze plumage, now beat not with former crushing power and grace, but with visible, painful, weary effort. Her gaze, sharp as a harpy's own, darted along the line of the dragon's ridge, along those gray, lifeless, jagged teeth biting into the pale, indifferent sky, searching, feverishly seeking any possibility, any slightest, ghostly chance, a crevice in this stone, soulless face of death. And she saw it, a small but wide enough stone ledge, like a stone balcony thrust out by the mountain itself in some ancient, long-forgotten cataclysm. It lay slightly off to the side of the main peak, almost at their height, dark, silent, and empty. It was not a cave, not a reliable shelter, but simply a platform, a place where they could gain solid, unshakable ground underfoot. That very earthly firmament they all now so desperately scorned in their flight, and so desperately, to the point of belly cramps, craved. A place where they could fight back, not constrained in every movement, back to a cold but reliable wall, facing the enemy, as befits warriors. The decision matured in her consciousness instantly, clear, cold, and hard as a drop of morning dew on a steel blade. She leaned forward, right to the hippogriff's head, feeling under her cheek the hot, moist warmth of his neck and the pungent, animal smell of sweat-drenched fur and feathers, and, not shouting, but almost putting her thought, her desperate intent directly into his mind through touch, intonation, and that thin, barely perceptible thread of mutual understanding that binds a true rider and steed, whispered right into his ear, into the very ear opening, believing he would understand, believing in this more strongly than anything in the world. There. The ledge. We need ground. She pointed desperately, sharply, with her hand towards the stone platform, and the sleeves of her traveling cloak lashed like banners in the wind. The hippogriff seemed to freeze for a moment, his golden, intelligent, weary eye, full of the same exhausting weariness and the same fierce, unyielding will that burned in her own heart, darted in the indicated direction. He saw the same thing she did: not shelter, not salvation, but a chance, the only chance to change tactics, to shed the burden of weightless, but so fragile bodies on their backs and give battle on their own accustomed terms, the battle of those who stand firmly on earth and look at the sky, not those who hang in emptiness, helpless and bound. Gathering the last of his strength, with muscles trembling from monstrous tension, he issued a new cry, not a furious howl, but a commanding, imperative, short and abrupt sound, cutting through the deafening symphony of battle like a knife, and, ignoring a harpy clinging to his withers and tearing out chunks of flesh and feathers with its claw, he lunged sideways towards the harsh, gray, but desired solidity of the cliff, his kin catching his maneuver with that sense stronger than words, with the fierce, blind stubbornness of the doomed who have seen a glimmer, fought their way after him, cutting off pursuers with short, mighty blows of beaks and slashing sweeps of taloned legs, clearing a path to the stone island in a sea of death. It was a desperate dash, a last surge of weary hearts pressed by the weight of the sky and their own exhaustion. The harpies, sensing the fat, desired prey slipping from their tenacious claws, fell upon the hippogriffs with new, feverish, almost insane force. Their piercing, ear-rending screech merged into one deafening, discordant hymn of pure, undiluted hatred, a sound that made teeth clench and backs go cold. But the hippogriffs, led by their leader, now flew with a single goal, straight and clear as an arrow loosed from a taut string. They did not evade attacks, did not counterattack, did not waste strength on maneuvers. They raced towards the stone, salvific shoulder of the cliff, like storm-tossed ships racing towards a dark, inhospitable, but desired and only shore, seeing in it their last salvation. The first hippogriff, the one carrying light Divial, landed on the ledge roughly, with a grating screech of claws scraping stone, striking short sparks. His massive body crashed down onto the solid, unbreakable firmness with a dull, heavy thud that shook the rock. Another followed, barely avoiding a chest-to-chest collision, his broad, wounded wing painfully buckling on impact, and the beast let out a choked, hoarse cry of pain. Lyriel felt the terrible, infinite flight that had lasted an eternity suddenly vanished beneath her hippogriff, and then his jagged, mighty hoof struck the solid, cold, rough surface of the rock with a dull, bone-jarring crash. He nearly stumbled forward from weariness and loss of balance, his forelegs buckling, but he held, straightened to his full immense height, shaking his whole body like an exhausted dog after a long, savage storm, shedding droplets of blood and sticky filth from his feathers, one by one, wounded, panting, with wing membranes hanging like tattered rags. They found themselves on the narrow, awkward stone platform, this huddle of living, heavily breathing, suffering beings lost amidst boundless, indifferent sky. The elves instantly, almost without touching the ground, as if afraid to be burned by its solidity, leapt from the backs, their light, graceful bodies finally freeing their mighty steeds from the last, constricting weight. Now, feeling the unshakable, reliable stone underfoot, the hippogriffs turned to face the black, seething cloud of harpies blotting the sky right before them, this moving, screeching wall of claws, feathers, and blind malice. And in their postures, in their proudly spread wings like huge shields, in their beaks ready for crushing, precise strikes, could be read not the desperation of a cornered, trapped beast, but the cold, silent, lethal fury of true masters of the skies, those who had rested, clawed out a scrap of their own earth from death's maw, and were ready to give battle on their own territory, to the last breath, to the last drop of blood. The platform became a tiny, bloodied bridgehead, a patch of solid rock wedged between the bottomless chasm of the sky and the cold, indifferent, eternal stone wall of the peak. The air above it literally bulged and tore with fury. It hummed like a heated cauldron and rang with screeches. The harpies, deprived of their easy prey in the sky, with piercing, soul-rending, fury, greed, and bitter disappointment-filled screeches, dive bombed the ledge like living, self-guided catapult shots, dark, swift smears against the pale, cold sky, bringing only blood, pain, and immediate end, freed from the need to spare the riders from that heavy, constraining burden of care that had bound their wings surer than steel nets. The hippogriffs showed what their true fury, that ancient, primordial, wild force sleeping in their overtaxed muscles, patiently awaiting its hour, was really worth. They no longer defended, no, now they attacked, and the very air element shuddered from their sudden, unleashed might. The leader, gathering his strength, every muscle tense to trembling, with a mighty, mini-hurricane generating beat of his huge wings, rushed to meet the largest, fiercest harpy, the leader of that flock. Their collision was terrible and inevitable, like two rocks meeting. It was accompanied by a dull, wet crunch of breaking bones and a gurgling, choking, full of incredible pain screamed the mighty, bronze-forged beak of the hippogriff clamped onto the leathery membranous in of the Predatoress. Crushing it, he twisted in the air with wild, predatory grace, flung her aside against the vertical, smooth cliff face, from which she rebounded like a stone from a sling, and, convulsing in final agony, plummeted down into the silent, bottomless abyss. Other hippogriffs, acting in coordinated pairs, with mute, honed cruelty, drove harpies under the crushing, no-chance blows of their kin. Their claws, each the size of a sharpened elven dagger that could slice silk, easily tore the vulnerable, membranous wings, and their beaks, sharp and merciless as razors, tacked out the yellow, hatred-burning eyes, leaving behind only empty, blood-oozing sockets. The sky filled not only with piercing cries, but with the wet, repulsive squelch of tearing flesh, and the dry, deafening, nightmarish crack of breaking bones, a sound that literally froze blood in veins. But there were too many harpies, these endless spawn of darkness and blind hatred, infinitely, innumerably many. They pelted the hippogriffs with a veritable hail of furious, disordered blows, clinging to their broad backs, sinking long, sickle-curved claws into withers and flanks, trying to blind, tear out whole clumps of feathers with chunks of living, warm flesh. One harpy, more cunning and patient than her frantic sisters, dug in with a death grip at the base of a young hippogriff's wing and hung there a heavy, burdening weight, making it lose altitude. List sideways, each new, desperate wingbeat now coming with unspeakable, tearing agony. Another, slipping under the belly like a gray shadow, struck with its claws at a thin, vulnerable tendon on a hind leg, and the mighty beast, with a painful, full of animal bewilderment and fury roar, nearly crashed right onto the sharp, knife-like stones of the ledge, barely holding on with trembling legs at the very edge of the precipice. On the ground, or rather, on this narrow, insignificant cornice hanging like a last hope between sky and imminent death, the elves built a living, breathing, unbreakable wall of their bodies. They stood shoulder to shoulder, facing the gaping chasm, covering the wounded hippogriffs, who, wheezing like bellows and licking their ragged wounds with dark, rough tongues, slowly retreated towards the salvific cliff wall, to the cold but reliable stone that was now their only cover and last line of defense. Shoulder to shoulder, commanded Aylar, and his voice, hoarse from weariness and parched throat, sounded with that ire, brooking no doubt firmness, that left no room for argument. Those who had not only bows but long, true blades immediately leveled them, creating before the formation a deadly, steel palisade gleaming in the pale sunlight. This last line, this final boundary, they had sworn to hold or die upon. Lirael, Fëanor, Lariel, and the other archers formed a second, no less formidable rank. Their fingers, wrapped in rough leather, knew no fatigue, moving with automatic, almost machine-like, flawless precision. They did not aim at such monstrously short distances and into such a solid, seething, screeching mass of feathers and claws. There was neither need nor opportunity. They simply loosed arrows, one after another, methodically, without pause, into this moving, roaring mess, diving at them with blinding speed. Every arrow seemed to find its own terrible target, a harpy with a thin, straight shaft deeply embedded in its throat, choking on its own screech, and gushing dark, thick blood, fell over the edge, disappearing into the silent, all-consuming abyss. Another, with an arrow protruding straight from an eye, thrashed helplessly and convulsively on the cold, merciless stone at their very feet, its curved claws feebly scratching the rock, making a grating, repulsive, wrenching sound, until one of the warriors finished it with a quick, merciless blow. The harpies did not yield, for they knew neither fear, nor pity, nor weariness. The cliff predators threw themselves at the elven line with the ferocity of wounded beasts, driven into the darkest corner, for whom there was nothing in the world but blind, all-consuming fury. One of them, slipping low under a deadly arrow whizzing overhead, dug long, sharp, needle-like claws into Tarlin's shoulder, trying to tear the mighty guard from the line. Drag him down in a fall. The powerful guard, not flinching, not even crying out in pain, with a short, precise blow of the heavy, metal-bound hilt of his blade to the feathered, bristle-covered head, a dull, nightmarish thud made it release its grip, and Orlin's blade, flashing in the air, like lightning in a storm cloud, finished it off. The fight on the ledge was a battle of utter exhaustion, where weariness gnawed at souls and will sharper than harpy claws gnawed at flesh. Muscles burned with a fire in which physical exhaustion and pure, furious malice were indistinguishable, and in parched throats stood the coppery, foul taste of blood, whether from teeth clenched to the point of cracking, or from spray flying from torn enemy throats. The air, once clean, mountain fresh, was now thick, heavy, and motionless. It smelled like a clotted, old wound on the side of a battle-scarred veteran Swedish, cloying, with an acrid, corrosive note of sweat, fear, and decay. In it floated light, fluffy down and heavy, bloodied feathers torn from mighty wings. They slowly, as if reluctantly, settled onto the sticky, already blood-soaked stone, lying on dark, oily stains greedily absorbed by the porous, insatiable rock. This smell was as complex as the battle itself, as death itself. Bitter wormwood of stems crushed by a stray hoof, the acrid, suffocating stench of bird droppings carried by the harpies like their banner, and beneath it all a persistent, piercing, unbearable stench of torn entrails and fresh, still warm meat, which tickled nostrils, tightened cheekbones, and caused a painful spasm in the stomach even in the most seasoned warriors. The wounded hippogriffs now fought differently, not straying far from the salvific, cold wall, with short, abrupt, sudden, and therefore even more terrifying lunges. They used the cliff as a shield, a solid prop, darting out from behind its outcrop like litten, bloody battering rams, and plunging into the thickest part of the harpy flock, trying to encircle the ledge in a dense ring, tearing that ring apart at the cost of their own flesh, hurling torn bodies into the abyss. The leader, his once gleaming golden plumage now utterly drenched in dried brown and fresh scarlet blood, acted with cold, almost machine-like, soulless and flawless cruelty. He did not roar, did not issue inspiring battle cries, only short, hoarse, guttural sounds like grinding stones escaped his chest, and with each such sound his beak or claws mercilessly tore apart another harpy, sending it into a long, final, silent fall. But he himself was grievously wounded, one wing, pierced in several places by sharp, dagger-like fangs, moved with obvious, painful effort, and from a deep, gaping wound on his flank, where dozens of claws had sunk, oozed bubbling foam mixed with something dark, almost black. Other hippogriffs, as if inspired by this silent, bloodied steadfastness of the leader, following his example, turned into something like living, breathing, flying bastions. They stood at the very edge of the precipice, where stones suddenly dropped away into cold, yawning emptiness, not retreating a step, not an inch, as if rooted into the cliff with roots of flesh and fury. Their mighty, titanic wings, each feather seeming cast of dark, eternal bronze, now beat not for flight, but for war. Each wingbeat was like a crushing blow of a two-handed mace, heavy, filled with pure fury and wild force, generating a hurricane wind. This wind, born of their will, hummed low and threateningly, like subterranean thunder before a landslide. It tore diving harpies off course, tumbled them in the sky, broke their swift, thousand attack-honed flight, depriving them of their main advantage. Those predators lighter and more agile whirled helplessly in this artificial, furious storm, like dry, dead leaves, their piercing, insane screeches lost and drowned in the deafening roar of the elements they themselves had provoked. And the few that did break through this invisible yet palpable wind barrier met not just the elements, but cold, calculating, unerring death. They were met by merciless, curved, dagger-like beaks capable of piercing steel breastplates, and claws, each like a sharpened reaper's sickle. Strikes were delivered with monstrous, predatory, almost mathematical precision to the base of the slender neck, under the leathery, vulnerable wing, into the unprotected, soft belly. A wet, soul and ear-rending sound of tearing flesh, a dry, deafening crunch of breaking bones, a short, abruptly cut-off screech, and then another dark, emaciated body, already lifeless and limp, plummeted into the abyss, leaving in the thin, cold air a short, dissipating trail of feathers and a scarlet, pinkish haze. The hippogriffs, having accepted this bloody sacrifice, merely shook their massive heads slightly with disgust, shaking off sticky, warm droplets from beaks and claws, and froze again in their formidable, unshakable stance. Their golden, intelligent eyes, full of ancient, impersonal and ruthless fury, ceaselessly, like radars, scanning the sky, seeking the next target, the next threat. They were not defending, they were holding the line, and the very rock under their heavy, solid hooves seemed part of their will, an extension of their unconquered, wild essence. Their final stronghold. The elves no longer shot. Arrows were spent, their elegant quivers emptied to the bottom. And besides, distance had shrunk to zero in this tight, stifling, bloody press at the very edge of the world where there was no room for an arrow's flight. Now it was close quarters butchery, desperate, merciless, and primitive, where every inch of space, every moment of time, every breath was paid for with someone's blood, someone's pain, someone's abruptly ended life. Ailer, turned into a bloody, unshakable rock of flesh and steel, stood in the very center of the wavering but unbroken, untorn line. His long, true blade, once gleaming with clean, polished metal, was now covered in dark, viscous slime and stuck, bloodied feathers. He no longer swung with beautiful arcs. There was no room. He delivered short, sharp, thrusting blows, precise and lethal as a snake's bite, striking harpies in the throat or straight into the chest when they tried to sink claws into him. Beside him, Tarlin and Orlin, shoulder to shoulder, breathing in unison, worked with long, sturdy spears, creating a dead zone right before the front line, inaccessible to slashing, scratching claws. Their shafts with blunt, heavy tips, with desperation-born force, shoved back, pushed away the surging, screeching, frantic creatures, not letting them breach the line, dying every precious second of this respite at the dearest price, the price of their own flesh and strength. Fëanor, his face once beautiful and proud as unadorned morning, now scratched bloody so that scarlet, warm wetness flooded his eyes, streamed down his cheeks and dripped from his pointed chin, fought two harpies at once, fending them off in the cramped space between the hot, trembling body of his hippogriff and the cold, indifferent cliff. One, smaller and more agile, he pinned to the cliff with a short, sharp, incredibly precise thrust of his blade, and it, uttering a last, gurgling, blood-bubbling screech, thrashed in agony on the point. But the second, larger, vicious and patient, taking advantage of his momentary unguardedness, dug into his shoulder with long, thin, needle-like claws, trying to reach his exposed throat with its curved, filthy, death-smelling beak. With a cry in which there was not only fury, a desperate, tearing from within pain, he grabbed it by the thin, bristle-covered neck, feeling under his fingers the slippery, cold skin and the pulse of life, and with all his remaining strength, the strength of last despair, smashed its head against the stone ledge. And in the brief silence born between other battle sounds, he distinctly heard the crunch of fragile, avian bones, and the body in his weakening hand suddenly went limp, became heavy and will-less. Lyrael, having discarded her now useless empty bow, fought with two short, elegant elven daggers that flashed in her hands like living, reflected lightning. Her movements, honed by centuries of relentless training in the quiet forest galleries, were swift, graceful, and deadly as a harpy's own, whose wild, frenzied nature she now mirrored and refracted in her own restrained fury. She dodged blinding, chaotic claw swipes, letting attackers pass by, feeling on her skin the icy wind from their leathery wings, and sank the narrow, sharp blades under wings into the unprotected, vulnerable base of the neck, finding weak, lethal spots between feathers and rough scale. She saw Eviel, her silver, always braided hair come loose and matted with blood and sweat, fighting back with the shaft of a broken bow, retreating to the very edge, to that fatal line beyond which lay only eternal, soundless fall. And how Halder, covering her with his old but still powerful chest, received a deep, terrible, ragged wound in his sigh, and his weary, wrinkled face contorted in a grimace of mute, all-consuming suffering. It was at this moment, when the battle's outcome seemed predetermined, when the scales had finally and inexorably tipped under the unbearable weight of weariness, wounds, and losses, that something happened, suddenly changing everything. The wounded hippogriff behind which Eviel sheltered, a huge, majestic beast with a dark, pulsing wound gaping on its flank, suddenly straightened to its full immense, seemingly even greater height, casting an enormous, threatening shadow on the bloodied stones. It seemed the very proximity of death, this icy chill of non-being, awakened in it an ancient, slumbering in the deepest depths furious force inherited from distant, mythical ancestors. From the eagles and griffins themselves, it let out a deafening, rock-shaking roar, not a cry of pain or animal fear, but a challenge full of such primordial, indomitable, all-shattering might that for a moment even the Harpies, these very embodiments of blind chaos and fury, hesitated in mid-air, and their deafening, endless screeching fell momentarily silent, overwhelmed by this roar. And then the remaining hippogriffs, as if obeying an invisible but imperious, deep-calling summons, all at once, like one huge, breathing creature, surged forward, not into the yawning, beckoning abyss, but along the narrow stone cornice, crushing and hurling into the void those Harpies that had dared to land on the stones right before them. This was no longer defense, no desperate, last-ditch holding action. This was a furious, localized, crushing counterattack within their tiny, bloody, but their bridgehead. They moved through the dense, screeching flock, ignoring new claws digging into their tormented, exhausted bodies, as if not feeling new pain, driven by only one thought, one goal, to Harpies, too slow to take flight in time, were swept from the edge by powerful, iron mace-like sweeps of huge wings. A third, the boldest and fiercest, the hippogriff leader, pierced with his beak with an ease frightening in its simplicity, skewering bone and flesh, and hurled it, feebly and convulsively thrashing, into the emptiness, where its screech instantly cut off. "Hold the line," shouted Lyrael, her voice breaking into a rasp, but steely resolve ringing in it. And she understood, felt with every cell of her weary body, that this was their last, fate-given or desperate twill-gifted chance to turn the tide of battle, to tear their lives from the very jaws of perdition. The elves, inspired by this sudden, animal, all-consuming fury of their winged allies, with new, drawn dash from dash the dash deepest dash depths dash of dash the dash soul, last reserve strength, fell upon the stunned, disorganized, lost its wild order and momentum enemy. Aelor, his long blade flashing again in the pale light, cleared space before him with wide, sweeping, confident blows, pushing back confused, confidence-lost Harpies to the very edge of the precipice, to their own doom. Tarlin and Orlin, working their long spears like one coordinated, flawless mechanism, covered his flanks, not letting the predators slip around the side, pushing them back into the crush and chaos. Even the grievously wounded Halder, gritting his teeth to the point of cracking, struggled to his feet, leaning his back against the rough, uneven cliff, and with short, precise, almost measured blows of his not long but true dagger, fended off attacks from those still trying to break through to him, to the weak spot in the defense. The Harpies, deprived of their blind initiative and momentum, that steel, unreasoning will that had driven them forward like a herd, wavered. Their piercing, deafening cries now sounded not with fury and bloodlust, but with confusion, bewilderment, and finally, piercing, pure, animal fear, which they so loved to sow in others. One by one, first hesitantly, looking back, then faster, panicked, they began to detach from the bloody, inhospitable ledge and rise into the air, understanding there would be no easy prey here, that the blind fury of these creatures, both elves and hippogriffs, might cost them not just a wound, but their lives, and that this life, their wretched, hungry life, had suddenly become dear to them. After a few minutes that seemed an eternity, marked only by the beating of parched hearts and the last convulsions of the dying, only elves and their wounded, life-bleeding but undefeated companions remained on the ledge. This tiny patch of stone now drenched not only in light but in the darkness of spilled blood. The last Harpies, with piercing, full of furious chagrin and unslaked greed screeches, like a beaten pack, vanished behind the dark, unassailable cliffs, dissolving in their shadows. Silence fell, not peaceful, but heavy, thick, suffocating, broken only by the heavy, wheezing, rasping breath of survivors, muffled, choked moans of the wounded trying not to scream, and the hoarse, spasmodic, bellows-like panting of hippogriffs, whose mighty, wounded sides heaved, pumping air into overtaxed lungs. Lyrael, leaning on a short dagger bloodied to the hilt, its point driven into a crack in the stone, surveyed her companions, these children of forest and pure light, now as dark, soot-blackened, smeared with filth and blood and emaciated as the deep, hopeless night itself. They were exhausted to the very limit of elven endurance, wounded, their once beautiful clothes turned to rags barely covering their bodies, but they were alive. Alive thanks to the blind, animal fury of the hippogriffs who had fought for them, and their own hard-won, road-forged courage that had not broken in the most terrible hour. The battle had been won. This small, local, yet incredibly terrible fight on the edge of the world. That the price had been terrible, irreplaceable, seared into each one's memory. The stone under their feet was slippery with dark, already sticky, beginning to coagulate blood mixed with feathers and dust. And the air, once clean, mountain fresh and ringing, now hung thick, cloying and sweet with the smell of death, decay, and copper. A smell that made throats tickle and nausea rise. Lyriel, translating her heavy, spasmodic, pain-fogged gaze from her wounded, darely standing on trembling legs, companions to her mighty, at now barely dash upright, dash on dash their dash hooves, steeds, whose magnificent wings were shredded to tatters and flanks scored with claws, understood with the icy, merciless clarity that comes only on the very brink of despair, when illusions burn to ashes. To fly further, to rise again into these treacherous, merciless skies, would be pure madness, slow suicide. The thought of ascending anew, of finding themselves again in that merciless, deceptive height where behind every turn of an air current new, insatiable and even more numerous flocks might lie in wait, evoked in her soul not fear, but icy, all-paralyzing horror, freezing the will. We cannot fly. Her voice sounded hoarse, torn like an old bowstring, but with that indisputable, steely clarity that brooked not a shadow of objection. Neither we nor they. She gave a short, pained nod towards the hippogriffs, and her heart clenched in her chest with sharp, living pain at the sight of their mute, dignified suffering, at seeing how they, masters of the skies, helplessly let their torn wings droop. Her gaze, desperate and tenacious as a mountain goat's, slid along the line of the ridge, along these gray, soulless, gloomy slopes, searching, seeking the slightest hope, and she saw it not down into the vertical, death-beguiling abyss, but along the steep but not vertical slope, a narrow, barely visible to the eye, precarious trail, resembling an animal path or an ancient, forgotten all fissure in the rock. It led not straight down into the green, beckoning valley lying far, far below, but on a downward slant, skirting the outcrop, and was lost in stunted, gnarled thickets of dwarf pines a bit lower. It was not a path, not a road, it was merely a hint of possibility, a weak, ghostly chance for descent, a last straw. There, she pointed to this barely discernible, precarious strip among gray stone, and in her cracked voice again, through weariness, rang that same iron resolve. We must descend at least a little, leave this open, wine-cursed place, find shelter, any crack, any fissure in this stone body. The descent was agonizing, slow, full of new, exquisite pain and chilling despair. It was not a swift, dizzying fall into the abyss, but every step on the crumbling, treacherous, unreliable slope came with incredible effort of will. Every movement echoed with aching pain in old and new wounds. The wounded hippogriffs, who could not fly, whose wings dragged powerlessly, pitifully over sharp stones, catching and tearing further, had to be supported, almost carried, embracing their powerful, hot necks and with difficulty, at risk to their own lives, guiding them along the gentlest, most dangerous path. They slipped, caught with blunt, worn claws on slippery, unreliable stones, and each choked. Full dash of dash animal dash bewilderment dash and pain cry from them, echoed with sharp, cutting pain in the elves' hearts, making them clench their teeth. The grievously wounded holder, who had lost consciousness from blood loss and pain, was carried in arms, nearly slipping from narrow, slippery ledges, feeling their own depleted muscles tremble from overexertion. How legs buckled. Aylar, himself barely standing, his deep wound in the side, aching and oozing dark moisture, walked last, offering his weary but still strong shoulder to those who could move but were too weak to do so. Without support, without this last point of aid, they did not descend into the valley. It was still far as the moon, unattainably far. They had only enough strength, the last crumbs of their will trembling at the very bottom of their souls, to go a few hundred feet lower, into the zone of sparse, stunted, but still existing forest, where bare, dead cliffs gave way to steep, but already traversable slopes overgrown with gnarled, twisted pines. When, finally, they found a relatively level area hidden from prying eyes by high rocky outcrop and scanty but dense trees, for many, both elves and hippogriffs, knees gave way, and legs simply refused to hold them. Ceasing to obey, they collapsed onto the ground, onto prickly needles and cold, damp moss, unable to take another step, defeated not by the enemy, not by Harpies, but by their own outer exhaustion, the emptiness that was more terrible than any blade. But to stop, to succumb to this exhausting, sweet weakness, was impossible, for stopping in this wild, inhospitable place, without walls and protection, meant certain, slow death from wounds, hunger, or new, unknown enemies attracted by the smell of blood, while some, barely staying on buckling legs, with hands trembling from weariness and nervous exhaustion, kindled a meager, pitiful fire, striking stubborn sparks from flint over a pile of dry twigs gathered with great effort. Others, gritting teeth against pain, set about the great and sorrowful task of saving those who still breathed, whose lives hung by a thread. Iviel and Rinel, with pale as linen, but incredibly determined, stone-hard faces, brought out the last, carefully preserved, precious stores of ointments smelling of honey, healing herbs, bitter roots, and hope. They went to all in turn, making no distinction between elf and hippogriff, between friend and mighty beast become brother in arms, applying rough but effective splints made of broken branches to a broken wing, washing deep, ragged, gaping wounds with clean, icy water from a mountain stream, bandaging bloodied, inflamed scars with strips of cloth cut from their own cloaks. All was done in silence, under the lulling and simultaneously frightening crackle of the young, unreliable fire, in the uneven, dancing light of which shadows on emaciated, gaunt faces danced like ghosts, reminding of the proximity of another, eternal darkness. Lyriel bandaged her own wound on the shoulder, a raw, deep one from which emanated a dull, insistent pain like the tolling of a distant bell, and slowly, with difficulty shifting her feet, as if each foot weighed a pound, approached the hippogriff leader. The majestic creature lay sprawled on the ground like a fallen titan, his mighty chest, once proud and unshakable as a cliff, now heaved heavily and spasmodically, and in his eyes, intelligent and weary, stood mute, suffering the kind deeper than words, which lives in the pupil of a wounded beast and requires no translation. She silently, without superfluous gesture, laid a hand on his hot, densely short, velvet-like fur-covered neck, feeling under her upon the living, tense, rapid beat of life, that very throb that unites all who breathe under this sky. The leader did not avert his eyes. His golden, piercing gaze rested on her face, and he uttered a quiet, hoarse sound like stones tumbling deep in a gorge, in which was both pain permeating every cell, and understanding that they had passed through the same fire, and mute, warm gratitude that she was here, beside him, that they were not alone in this cold world. They had found a temporary haven, a tiny, unremarkable patch of land among cold, silent cliffs and a few gnarled but living trees huddled in crevices. All were wounded and exhausted to the very limit, to that line where the body screams for rest and the soul clings to life by force of habit alone. But they were alive. It was a simple, cruel, undeniable fact, and in it lay their entire present victory, not loud, not adorned with glory, but real, hard-won with every breath. The camp, pitched on the hidden, lost platform, gradually, day by day, acquired the features of a severe, Spartan order, born not of a desire for comfort but of bare, joyless, inexorable necessity to survive, to last another day, to meet another dawn. The air here, under the sparse but proud pines, was saturated with the clean, cold, resinous smell of pine needles, the acrid, soul-soothing smell of smoke from the ever-burning fire, and the bitterish, astringent, medicinal aroma of healing ointments that hovered over the whole camp, mingling with the damp smell of earth, sweat, and quiet hope. The wounded hippogriffs lay in the very center of the camp, forming a living, breathing, dry animal warm-emitting barricade of mighty bodies and carefully, almost tenderly bandaged, slowly healing wings, their wounds, deep and ragged, day after day reluctantly but surely closed over, covered with pink, tender, young skin resembling wild rose petals. The elves to lick their wounds, and with each day their movements, still cautious, stiff with the memory of pain, regain some of their former, innate grace, that which distinguishes children of the forest from other mortals, though now burdened with the weight of horrors endure, and an unrelievable weariness, that cast a shadow on the brightest faces. Iviel, having regained some strength, finding in the depths of her depleted soul an unknown reserve, found strength not only for her own recovery but to help others. In the evenings, when the sun leaned towards the jagged peaks, tainting the sky in the colors of a dying fire, crimson, gold, and deep blue, she would walk around the camp, approaching each wounded, be it an elf with a gaping scratch or a hippogriff with a deed, ragged and inflamed wound on its flank. Her face, still pale, almost translucent, was focused and calm, as if she were listening to a quiet, ancient music sounding in the very blood of the earth. inaccessible to ordinary hearing. She did not speak much, only quietly, in a sing-song, almost whisper, uttered words in that ancient tongue older than mountains and rivers. So old that even other elves caught only echoes, fragments of meaning, something about light living in the heart of a leaf, about the life-giving, warm power of earth sleeping under snow, about the thin, silvery, invisible to the eye threads of life binding all that exists into a single, ever-renewing, ever-suffering and ever-reborn pattern. Then she would place her slender, elegant, almost fragile-looking palms upon the wound, and under her touch, quiet and confident, a miracle occurred, unspectacular and unremarkable, but no less real for that. Her hands would begin to glow with an even, warm, golden light, like the light of summer sun piercing through dense, emerald foliage in a deep forest glade, not blinding, not cutting to the eyes, but soft, soothing, almost tangible in its gentle tenderness. And under this light, under this quiet blessing, flesh seemed to heal faster, regaining a forgotten will to live. Inflammation subsided like water after a flood. Edges of deep, ragged cuts gently, almost tenderly drew together, as if an invisible hand stitched them fresh, pink, young tissue formed before the eyes a bit faster than ordinary. Unhurried laws of nature allowed. The heavy, sweetish glowing smell of pus and decay ceased to emanate from the wounds, giving way to the clean, fresh, living scent of rain just passed over young grass, and damp, good earth. The hippogriffs, proud creatures usually wary of any alien touch, grew still under her hands, their tense, stone-like muscles relaxed, and heavy, spasmodic. Hoarse breathing became deeper and more even, like that of a mighty beast that has finally found a safe den, and can allow itself to forget in sleep. This was not an instant, nosy, blinding act of magic, no. It was a slow, careful, patient granting of additional strength for healing to nature itself, to the very flesh. That ancient, almost forgotten harmony between being and world that had been the natural, ordinary lot of her people. Lyrael stood over empty, dust and longing rending quivers laid out on her tattered traveling cloak, with a cold, heavy stone in her soul, with the agonizing, unrelenting clarity of realizing the full depth of their sudden vulnerability, their exposed defenselessness. They had run out of arrows, the last, sharpened to razor edge and true as their own fingers once had been expended in that mad, bloody meat grinder on the stone ledge, given to the wind and enemy flesh. Now their bows, these elegant, deadly, become extensions of the elves themselves. Part of their soul and hand were useless. They had turned into beautiful but helpless toes, no more than curved sticks and a taut string. They had become blind and deaf to anything farther than an arm's reach, defenseless against any threat lurking in the distance, around a bend in the trail, in the thicket of the forest, in the height of the sky. Without arrows we are defenseless, she said quietly, with that clear, glass-sharp clarity born in the grave silence after a storm, addressing Aylar, who was nearby. In her words there was no panic, no hysteria, only cold, merciless statement of the terrible, undeniable fact. We cannot go on without replenishing our stores, at least some, the crudest, the most wretched, but we must. In response he only gave a grim, heavy nod, his experienced, tenacious, scanning gaze immediately sliding over the surrounding forest, over the slender and gnarled tree trunks that from a threat could now become their only salvation. Their armory. There are straight, suitable branches here, Aylar said, his voice dry and businesslike. You, Hornbeam, the wood is hard, resilient, will hold flight. He touched with fingers, accustomed to other work, the worn, soft leather edge of an empty quiver, and in this simple gesture could be read a whole life dedicated to bow and arrow. The life of an archer, but arrowheads, without obsidian or good forged iron, honed in the forges of Ulnor. They'll be just sharpened sticks, children's toes, against armor or thick hide. Mere mosquito bites won't pierce, only anger. It's better than nothing, Lyrael countered firmly, with that will that bend steel and break stone, not letting doubt creep into her voice. We'll spend a day, all strength, all hands that can hold a knife or a stone. We'll search for suitable wood. We'll fire harden the tips for hardness, sharpen them with flint shards. At least a dozen such arrows each. That's already force, that's already not complete. Humiliating helplessness, their day, until then filled only with burdensome rest and monotonous healing, acquired a new, urgent, burning and clear goal, while some, like Iviel, with face drawn from sleepless nights, continued to tend the most gravely wounded, changing bandages soaked with ichor and ointments. Others, led by Fëanor, delved into the thicket, They moved like shadows, slipping silently between trunks. Their eyes, accustomed to distinguishing shades of green, now sought straight, even, knotless and treacherously curved shoots of suitable trees. Their hands, quick and precise, cut choice branches with sharp knives and carried growing, heavy armfuls smelling of fresh resin and hope back to camp. Others, under the watchful, attentive guidance of Aylar, whose own aching wound in his side did not leave him, but who could not sit idle seeing the common goal, crawled over the stony slopes around the camp. They gathered suitable, razor-sharp, time-chipped shards of flint and dark, volcanic obsidian, which could be attached, bound to the shaft with thin strips of rawhide cut from belts or cloaks instead of proper, socketed arrowheads. Work, hard, meticulous, and unfamiliar to elegant elven hands, seethed until evening, until the last, watery sun rays began to fade behind dark peaks. The air filled with the monotonous, insistent, stubborn clatter of stone on stone, the creak of a knife stripping bark from smooth wood, and the acrid, bitter smell of char as they bent over the fire. Fire hardened the sharpened ends of future arrows to give the wood at least some additional hardness, make them at least a little more deadly. They were crude, ungainly, almost ugly objects, only remotely, by the most general, primitive shape resembling those elegant, flawless, deadly arrows, once lovingly made in the quiet workshops of Lindorn's forests. But each such sharpened stick, carefully, almost with religious, reverent awe laid at the bottom of an emptied quiver, returned to them, the elves, a grain of lost confidence, a small but precious measure of control over their own fate. It was not a weapon, but a symbol of refusal to capitulate. On one such day, when morning was just breaking, coloring the sky the hue of pale lilac, the hippogriff leader, with visible, painful effort, groaning and straining every trembling muscle, but firmly and inexorably, as the sun rises, got to his strong though still trembling from weakness legs. He stretched, slowly, carefully, with pain unfolding his damaged, tightly bandaged wing, and looked questioningly, almost demandingly at Lyriel with his golden, intelligent, long-suffering eyes. His gaze, mute and eloquent, was clearer than any words. "We have shed blood together. We have rested. We are ready. What next? When do we move out?" Lyriel slowly approached him, again laying her palm on his warm, powerful neck, feeling under the thin skin the steady, strong vibration of life beating within. Her gaze for a moment slid over the crude, makeshift arrows sticking like pitiful thorns from her quiver, and something in her soul constricted from their wretchedness, from this fall from the height of their former art. But then something within straightened, grew stronger from a quiet, stern pride in what had been done, in this will to create weapons from nothing, in this refusal to surrender. "Tomorrow," she said quietly, so that the words were audible in the crystalline morning silence, sounding like a vow, to him and to all who could hear, who held their breath. "We move at dawn." Now something immeasurably greater than a fleeting agreement or simple, momentary mutual benefit bound them. Between elves and hippogriffs stretched an invisible but strongest, tempered steel thread, a thread of lives saved by each other, and of blood spilled together on the same stone. In the same fury, they looked at each other and saw no longer mere temporary allies, not accidental fellow travelers in misfortune, but those who had stood shoulder to shoulder, back to back on the very brink of doom, over the abyss, and had not retreated, not betrayed, not broken, not abandoned. This bond, born in mountains, blood, and shared fear, manifested not in loud speeches or oaths, but in quiet, everyday, almost invisible little things that became the new language of their strange brotherhood. When Iviel, with a wooden bowl of clean water and fresh, white bandages in hand, approached a young hippogriff with a broken but healing wing to change the dressing, it did not flinch, did not toss its head with mute threat, did not snap its beak. It allowed her, this fragile, elegant elf-maid, to touch its most vulnerable, most painful wound, and while doing so made a quiet, low sound like the deep purring of a huge cat, born deep in its throat, a sound of trust and peace, more eloquent than any oath. And when Aylar, overcoming his own toothache-like pain in his side, brought his steed, with whom he had soared in the heavens and nearly fallen together, an armful of lush grass found in a mountain hollow, it did not snatch it greedily, beast-like, but slowly, almost ceremoniously, with dignity inclined its mighty, eagle head and took the food carefully, almost tenderly. Its golden, full of non-human depth gaze rested for a short, speaking moment on the elf's face, and in that gaze was something immeasurably more than simple. Animal gratitude, it was acknowledgement, mute and complete. Lirael and the flock leader understood each other without a single sound. Their communication occurred on another, deeper, ancient plane where words were but a poor, tale semblance of the true, risen connection. Their glances, meeting, exchanged whole stories written in pain, fury, and blood. Of the whistle of claws in the air right by the temple, of sticky, warm blood on feathers and cloaks, of mute, desperate gratitude for a covered back in that decisive moment, when curved harpy claws were already about to sink into an unprotected neck, and only a timely offered wing or a precise, desperate blow of a blade diverted death. Granting one more breath, they had become responsible for each other, their fates intertwined in a tight, inseparable, deathly tight knot. The elves, whose honor and duty had been forged in centuries of songs and legends, could not simply walk away, abandoning their winged brothers while they, mighty and proud, recovered from wounds dealt in a common, not their battle. The hippogriffs, these free and proud children of sky and wind, in whose veins flowed the wild blood of eagles and griffins, felt the dull, unfamiliar before, heavy duty to carry those to whom they, by fate's will or their own chose, had entrusted their backs, to the very end of the path, wherever it led, into mist or fire. The young hippogriff, whose wounded wing healed faster than others, with difficulty, overcoming weakness, but resolutely, would rise and slowly, like a faithful sentinel, patrol the camp along its very perimeter, its keen, true predator eyes seeking any, the slightest potential threat in the surrounding forest, a bush stirring, a suspicious sound, while its kin, breathing heavily and spasmodically, rested, gathering strength for a new day. And the elves, in turn, shared the last, carefully saved drops of precious healing concoctions, rubbing them not only into their own aching wounds, but into the deep, ragged, still fresh scars on the hippogriff's flanks and wings. Their slender, skillful fingers, accustomed to bowstring and harp strings, cautiously, with tenderness touched the dark, clotted blood and inflamed, hot skin. And in this touch was all their mute language, all their new, strange friendship. They were no longer two different, alien races who had chanced upon each other on the same road. They had become a company, a single, breathing, thinking whole, where a mighty, wine-creating wingbeat was as important and necessary to all as a precise, unerring shot from a bow, even if that bow was now crude and imperfect. And when that morning came, transparent and cold, and they, gathering their scant belongings and pitiful supplies, prepared to set out, there was no need for long orders, persuasion, or discussion. The hippogriffs, not yet fully recovered, their movements stiff, cautious and not without pain, but full of unshakable, bestial resolve, one by one stood, ready to accept their riders. And in their proud, composed postures could be read not obedience, but alliance and voluntary partnership. They knew their path henceforth was common. Their fates had intertwined there, on the stone ledge drenched in common blood and lit by common fury. And now they were led forward not only by duty or agreement, but by a silent, unspoken, memory-seared oath given to each other in the darkest, most desperate and bloody hour, an oath to go to the end. At dawn, when the first sun rays only touched the pine tops, coloring them the hue of old gold, they set out. But this was no panicked flight devoid of purpose, nor was it the former proud, confident flight of masters of the skies who know no barriers. It was a slow, deliberate, full of mutual support and wariness movement forward, step by step, wingbeat by wingbeat. The hippogriffs, whose wings had not yet regained their former, crushing might and former lightness, did not rise high into the cold, thin, deceptive heights. They glided just above the treetops, barely touching them with their powerful, taloned feet, conserving every drop of strength, every movement, and their shadows, huge and sprawled, slid over the ground beside the elves walking below, like dark, faithful doubles. It was a strange, hybrid, almost unthinkable before mode of travel. Part of the company soared in the cool air, part strode firmly and unhurriedly over dusty earth, but all of them, those aloft and those below, were united in their intent and their inexorable goal, bound by an invisible thread of common will. When the ground path became too difficult, almost impossible, a deep, dark, wound-like chasm suddenly gaped before them, or a raging, foam-chef flecd with fury and snow-melt mountain river, whose roar drowned all other sounds. The hippogriffs, as if understanding without words, sensing the tension in the walkers' postures, descended. They did not allow the elves to waste precious days and last, already dwindling strength on exhausting, dangerous detours. Instead, the sturdiest among them, with quiet, hoarse grunts, lifted the weakest and wounded onto their broad backs, while the remaining elves, clinging to sharp stones and tenacious roots, made their own way across. This was not a simple service or calculation of returned favor. It was a simple and clear action speaking for itself, in a language all now understood. We are strong in this, we will help. Your weakness is now our concern too. We are one. In turn, the elves became the eyes and ears of the whole flock on the ground, its sensitive antennas in a world full of invisible threats. Their hearing, raised in the solemn silence of ancient forests, caught what the hippogriffs in the air, deafened by the whistle of wind and the noise of their own wings, could not hear the distant, barely discernible, but ominous barking of guard dogs from an invisible over the hills village. The suspicious, dry grating of a stone that had rolled somewhere high in the mountains for no apparent reason. Aylar, with his many-year, hard-won experience as a tracker, led the whole group, plotting the route so they always had relatively firm, non-crumbling ground underfoot and nearby, within a quick dash, at least some cover. A cave, a dark maw in the rock, a jumble of boulders, a dense, impassable thicket encased to hippogriffs, feeling sudden weakness in damaged wings or a threat from the air, needed to land urgently, immediately. At halts, short and anxious, they did not divide into two separate, alien, silent camps. The hippogriffs lay down, forming a living, warm, breathing wall of bodies and spread wings like shields, protecting the fragile, emaciated elves from the piercing, freezing mountain wind howling in the gorges like a hungry beast. And those, in turn, shared their meager, hard-won provisions, the last bitter berries and tough, but edible roots, and continued, already out of habit, out of heart's need, to tend their closing but still terrible wounds. Lirael often sat beside the leader, leaning her back against his day-warmed by movement, mighty flank, and they would gaze eastward for hours, not uttering a word, to where in the crimson haze of sunset or the cold blue of morning their goal, their curse and their hope, lay hidden. Between them there was no need for words, but there was complete, almost frightening in its depth, mutual understanding. They bore a common burden, not only physical weariness, aching pain in old wounds, but the heavy, invisible weight of responsibility for those who walked with them, and for that vague, mirage-like goal calling them forward into impenetrable unknown, where either salvation or final doom awaited them. They were no longer merely elves and hippogriffs. To races whose paths had diverged in hoary antiquity, they had become fellow travelers, kindred in the crucible of common trouble, in the melting pot of suffering, fury, and blood spilled together. And each new day of the journey, each new, hard-won mile only strengthened this strange, mute, but strongest bond, born in the fire of battle and forged in the silence of shared suffering. The world around might be hostile, full of hidden threats and open, unmotivated hatred, but in the very heart of their small, wounded, weary company glowed an unquenchable, living spark of what is stronger than any magic and any ancient racial enmity loyalty paid for with one's own blood and tested on the very brink of doom, when there was nowhere to retreat. Thus they went for several long, exhausting days, slowly as eternity itself, but inexorably, like a single, complex, breathing in unison organism, part of which soared in the cool, thin air, part strode firmly, stubbornly over dusty, stony earth. And then one morning, having crossed another scrub-covered, stunted hilly ridge, shielding their eyes from the dazzling, low-standing sun, they saw something that both gave hope and plunged them into deepest, soul-freezing despondency. Ahead, beyond the still green but already sparse foothills, rose, propping up the low sky with their stone shoulders, the eastern spurs of the Dragon's Ridge. But these were no longer those titanic, unassailable, eternal snow-blinding peaks through which they had once, it seemed an eternity ago, ticked their way in utter darkness through underground tunnels. Here the majestic ridge began to lower, breaking into a series of steep, deeply gashed mountain chains resembling petrified, furious waves of some grand, forgotten sea. To pass here on foot, clambering over crumbling, treacherous slopes, would still be deadly dangerous, almost suicidal, especially for the not yet recovered wounded. And the hippogriffs, even the strongest and almost recover, could not lift them to such height with the burden the thin, prickly, strength-sapping air and strong, unpredictable, mad updrafts would make any flight impossible, a pure gamble leading straight to death in the stone paws of these giants. Lirael, standing on the edge of a small but open to all wings and gazes outcrop, peered at this new, unexpectedly risen mountain barrier, this stone sea. Beside her, breathing heavily and nosily, with a whistle drawing in air, stood the hippogriff leader. T2, turning his proud, eagle head, looked forward, and by the way muscles tensed and play under the skin on his neck, she understood without words. By instinct alone he too saw this seemingly impassable barrier, this new, mocking wall on their path, erected by fate itself. "We will not go through them," she said quietly, but so that her voice, hoarse from weariness, was audible to all, and in her words was not a shadow of fear or doubt, only cold, honed, iron resolve. "Neither up onto these stone fangs, nor through their ribs. Nothing in this world will make us voluntarily descend into that stone hell, that blind darkness we have already once endured and barely survived." And then first, breaking the momentary, heavy silence, old Halder made a suggestion, leaning with difficulty on his crude, makeshift staff, every knot on which remembered the weight of his hand. "South, the mountains there, on old, decayed maps, should peter out, abutting the endless eastern steppes. A long way, very long, but flat as a dying man's palm. We could walk, not spending last strength on ascents. They," he nodded at the hippogriffs, "could fly low, conserving what they have left." Lyrael slowly, with uncharacteristic sharpness, shook her head, her gaze fixed eastward, as firm, unshakable, as the very rock underfoot. "Our path lies not south, old friend. We need to the other side of the ridge straight east, into the northern steppes, where the star fell. To go south is to make a huge, hundreds of leagues to tour and spend months I feel in my skin, simply do not have. Time does not wait. It slips through fingers like sand." For a moment she shifted her gaze to the hippogriff leader, seeing in his intelligent, golden eyes the same, unmistakable understanding, the same impatient fury, then stared again at the mountain chain, studying every fold, every dark curve, every yawning fissure. "We will not go over the passes, but we might find a passage, a gorge, a fissure, or river valley that cuts this ridge through, like a blade pierces flesh. There must be at least one path, at least one." The idea, risky and almost insane, hung in the cold, thin air, and a long silence fell, broken only by the howling of the wind. It was a huge, desperate risk. They could spend days, even weeks, in fruitless, exhausting search for a non-existent path, finally exhausting both themselves and their faithful winged companions. But it was their only, last chance to continue moving straight east, without abandoning the goal, without betraying that for which they had shed so much blood. The hippogriff leader, listening attentively, with predatory concentration to this mute but eloquent dialogue, suddenly stirred, his sharp ears twitching alertly, catching something inaccessible to others. He issued a short, imperative, piercing cry, beat his huge, almost healed but not yet regaining former might wings, rose into the air and flew east. Along the very foot of the ridge, his keen, tireless gaze attentively, foot by foot, studying every dark slope, every ominous crevice in the cliffs, every hint of possibility. He was seeking a path, their path. "He understands," exclaimed Iviel, and in her voice, hoarse from weariness, sounded that same, long-forgotten, almost childlike hope that makes hearts beat faster. "He is looking for a passage. He is seeking a way for us all." Obeying the new, born of desperation plan, they set out again, now unwaveringly and strictly eastward, forward, tearing at every fold of terrain, every dark, yawning, and wound-like spot of a gorge, while their winged scout, like a shadow, mute and purposeful, combed the pale, merciless sky ahead, trying to find that very single trail leading through the stone wall to the distant and desolate, soul-chilling northern wastes. Thus they went for many long, exhausting, monotonous days, slowly moving south along the majestic and unassailable foot of the Dragon's Ridge. The endless, gray, ashen stone wall stretched to their left, like the back of a sleeping but watchful giant, now receding with gentle, scrub-covered, stunted foothills, now overhanging again with unassailable, vertical, wine-polished cliffs whose jagged peaks were lost in tattered, low clouds. Day after day, from morning till evening, the hippogriff scouts, straining themselves, combed the slopes, returning to camp weary, covered in mountain dust, with empty claws and that hopeless, extinguished gleam in intelligent, amber eyes that spoke more eloquently than any words of failure. Every gorge, at first promising passage, dark and cool slit beckoning, turned out to be treacherous, merciless dead, and every canyon, beckoning inward with salvific shade, ended in a sudden, skyward rising vertical wall, smooth and hopeless, leaving not the slightest hope. A quiet, cold, creeping despair, like a poisonous snake, began to steal upon the weary, tormented travelers, poisoning their hearts with its black, sticky shadow. Even the unshakable Ailer, whose will always seemed forged of the finest steel, more and more often cast long, heavy, gloomy glances southward, where by hints of old, wine-tattered maps and half-forgotten tales of gray-haired bards should lie long, winding the tour-de-tour routes through endless, flat as a table eastern steppes. But to go there meant to doom themselves to many months of exhausting, slow travel, time which they, each felt in the depths of his soul, simply did not have. For their goal, that fallen star, that mute cry in the world's heart could not wait. Time was slipping through fingers like water. And then on a sultry, stifling noon of yet another day of this tedious, endless journey, when the sun stood at its zenith, scorching the earth with merciless, blinding light, the hippogriff leader, exploring an especially deep and gloomy, grave-like fissure in the cliffs, suddenly gave a desperate, summoning, piercing signal. His cry, usually guttural, commanding and full of calm confidence, this time sounded different, and it could be heard both a trembling, uncertain hope, and a nervous, feverish tremor, and impatient, burning expectation. When the whole company, holding their breath, with a lump of weary heart, reached the indicated place, a sight opened before them that took each one's breath away. Between two titanic, sky-propping peaks gaped a huge, black rift, not just a gorge, but a gigantic, unnatural, surgically made cleft, as if once in terrible, incomprehensible fury the very earth had cracked open here forever. Unwilling to close, its width was more than sufficient for a whole flock of hippogriffs to fly in formation, without wingtips touching the smooth, dark walls. But the main thing, it went deep into the very heart of the ridge, lost in a hazy, wavering, impenetrable haze to the east. No light, no glimmer at the end of this stone, gloomy corridor was visible, only an endless, frightening in its stead, lifeless perspective series of receding into invisible distance cliff walls, converging somewhere there in the distance. By all maps, by all old legends, this should not be here, whispered old Halder, his voice trembling with amazement and superstitious fear, his eyes wide open, boring into the mysterious, beckoning depth of the rift. But it is here. Stands before us, awaits. Lirael stood on the very edge of the precipice, feeling the damp, cold, born dash and dash the dash depth dash of dash the dash gorge wind strike her face, tussling her tangled, dusty hair. She looked into this gigantic stone gallery receding into impenetrable unknown, into the thickest gloom, and with icy, unmistakable clarity understood this was their only, last chance, granted them by fate itself or a mockery of dark gods. There would be no other. We go, she said simply, without pathos, without superfluous words, and in her low, hoarse from weariness voice there was no room for doubt, fear, or objection. There was only decision. The hippogriff leader, soaring right over the maw of the rift, issued a new, deafening, triumphant cry, this time imperative, full of impatience and new, flaring like a torch resolve. He already saw their path. He was already leading them. He was their guide in this stone labyrinth. They entered the rift at sunset, when the long, crimson, bloody shadows of the peaks completely swallowed the stony, uneven floor of the gorge, and the world around them plunged into thick, velvet twilight, with the last scarlet, fading sun rays hiding behind the jagged ridge crest. The familiar, comprehensible world of light, colors, and open spaces vanished. Only the insistent, mournful howling of wind, the cold, rough, hostile stone underfoot, and the endless, light-absorbing tunnel between slowly converging cliffs receding into impenetrable, living darkness remained. They traversed the great rift for many days, which lost count and meaning in this realm of eternal, hopeless twilight. The sun, appearing briefly at its zenith, slid a thin, dazzling, painful to the eyes thread along the very edge of the high, almost meeting at the top walls, unable to dispel the thick, cold, motionless shadows eternally reigning at the gorge's bottom, like water at a well's bottom. The air was cold, damp, and heavy, smelling of age-old, mute stone, dampness, mold, and something else, a barely perceptible, the persistent metallic tang, as if they walked through giant, long cooled but still preserving in their depths the heat of red-hot coals of a great forge, in which the world had been hammered. They walked almost in silence, conserving meager strength for the most necessary for the next step. For the next breath, the echoing, multiply, frightening echo of their cautious, uncertain steps on crumbling, ringing stones mixed with the eternal, insistent, monotonous hum of wind whistling in countless fissures, and the distant, unceasing, obsessive rumble of an invisible, raging, possibly subterranean river raging somewhere in impenetrable, black depth, beneath their feet. The hippogriffs flew ahead in a small, disciplined detachment, their keen, adapted to semi-darkness and long distances eyes seeking the path in thickening twilight, and their sharp, abrupt, imperative cries, reflected from smooth, mirror-like cliffs, sounded like voices of ancient, stone, forgotten spirits guarding these places. Unwilling to release anyone, at nights, if this dark, starless time could be called night, they made a meager, pitiful camp on rare, more or less level spots, pressing their backs to the cold, last heat-stealing cliff that was both their shelter and their prison. They lit no fire, there was simply nothing to burn in this stone sack, this granite tomb, and besides, trembling, living flame could attract the attention of unwanted, perhaps downright hostile denizens of these depths, whom it was better not to disturb. They warmed themselves only with the meager, quickly escaping warmth of their own shivering bodies and the living, powerful, animal heat of the hippogriffs, who, as if understanding this, without words, lay around them in a dense, breathing, rough palisade, becoming a living shield against the icy, penetrating wind that roamed the gorge like a ghost. With each new day of this subterranean, endless wandering, Liriel felt more strongly and distinctly, to the point of shivers, the strangeness, unnaturalness, alienness of this place. The air grew heavier, thicker, and in it, through the constant nose of wind and echo of steps, that same, painfully familiar to her from the black tunnels of dwarven halls, low frequency, obsessive vibration, intensified and insistent, soundless but bone-felt hum that, it seemed, only she could hear. It was diffused in the very space, in every stone, yet just as relentless and troubling. It came not from under the earth, but as if from the very ancient, living cliffs surrounding them on all sides, as if the whole great, sleeping ridge, or a giant resonator transmitting into the world some ancient, incomprehensible, all-pervading pain, a longing for something lost. One day, when they stopped at yet another meager, dreary campsite, unable to hold this heavy knowledge within herself any longer, she shared her sensation with old Halder, whose wisdom, forged by centuries, was now their only compass in a world without maps. "I feel it more strongly," she said quietly, almost whispering, so as not to wake the echo, her gaze fixed into the dark, bottomless, frightening depth of the gorge. "The same hum, only here. It's not underfoot. It's everywhere. In the very stone. It breathes." The old scout froze and, with his whole being listened, turning his wrinkled, sagging ear to the cold wall, but, as before, heard nothing except the howling of the eternal wind and his own rapid, hoarse breathing. Only silence, thick and mute. "The mountains are old, my child, very old," he creaked at last. "They remember much that we mortals have not even dreamed of. Perhaps you hear the echo of those ancient, terrible times when they themselves were born from fire, pain, and primordial chaos, or—" He paused, and in his dim but still sharp eyes flashed a shadow of unease, deep and dark. "The echo of what is happening to them now, right now, while we walk here." Soon the air, in the depth of the rift, began to change slowly but inexorably, like the mood of a gravely ill person. The damp, stagnant, rotten smell of age-old stone and dampness gradually, day by day, was displaced by a new, much sharper, bitter, and joyously mournful one, the relentless, recognizable smell of the wastes. It carried the pungent, dusty aroma of heather, bitter as bile wormwood, dry dust, and something inexplicably cold, empty, and lifeless, as if eternity itself, icy and absolutely indifferent, had exhaled it towards the weary travelers as a warning. The wind, before restlessly and chaotically wandering between narrow cliffs, became steadier, stronger, and acquired a penetrating, icy sharpness, the very kind that carves faces and freezes souls. And then, ahead, at the very end of the endless stone corridor, a light appeared, barely noticeable at first, not the warm, life-giving light of the sun, but an even, cold, milky white, blurred reflection. With each new day of travel, it grew slightly brighter, slightly more distinct, and the gorge walls gradually, reluctantly, began to draw apart, becoming lower and lower. Finally, one morning, After many days of wandering in stone twilight, they, making a last effort, emerged. The dragon's ridge remained behind them, a titanic, jagged stone wall casting a long, cold shadow on their backs, like a last farewell from a departed world. And before them, stretching to the very edge of the earth as far as their sight could reach, lay the northern steppes in all their merciless and silent splendor. The endless, dully flat plain seemed to have neither beginning nor end, lost in the gray, blurred haze of the horizon. The earth, cracked from cold, was covered with withered, gray-brown grass that only occasionally and reluctantly swayed under gusts of penetrating wind. Here and there, like forgotten bones of some prehistoric giant, lone, wine-worn and gnarled stones jutted from the frozen soil. The sky, hanging over this emptiness, was low, heavy, leaden-grayed, and through rare, tattered breaks in the clouds poured that same cold, lifeless, and flat light they had once seen from afar, from the gloom of the rift. Not a tree, not a living hill, not a sign of a stream, only endless, untiring flat desolation, evoking an aching, all-consuming feeling of loneliness and abandonment. What met them here was not merely the cold of mountain peaks. What met them was an all-pervading, soul-freezing frost that not just nipped exposed skin but slowly, inexorably seeped into the very core, into bones, stiffening every movement and making thoughts grow numb. The wind, meeting no more barriers in the form of cliffs or trees, now howled openly and with impunity, creeping under the densest cloaks, making even the elves, accustomed to the fresh coolness of Lindorn's forests, huddle and teeth chatter. The first long night beyond the ridge they spent burrowing, like small animals, into their thin cloaks and desperately pressing against the warm, living flanks of the hippogriffs, without the salvific protection of cliffs that had sheltered them all previous weeks. From the full force of the elements, the cold seemed a living, thinking, and hostile being, purposefully and maliciously sucking the last drops of warmth from their bodies. Even a fire, finally kindled from stunted, hard-gathered bundles of thorny scrub, could not drive away this all-pervading, total chill. Its flame seemed pitiful and helpless in the face of this icy infinity. They lay, tossing and turning, unable to close their eyes and listen to the lonely, mournful howling of wind in the boundless, black expanses, with icy clarity, understanding that they had reached only the foot of their true path. Ahead, as far as the eye could see, lay the steppes unpeopled, cold, and perhaps harboring in their icy, merciless core the very secret of the fallen star that had brought them here. They walked across the endless, dead plain, heads hunched into shoulders, trying to hide faces from the icy slaps of wind. Each step echoed with a dull, lonely thud on the frozen, iron-hard earth, and this sound only emphasized the deafening silence around. All, from the youngest Sineal to gray-haired Halder, involuntarily, with hope and anxiety, glanced at Lyrael, seeking in her closed, gaunt face not only guidance for action, but silent confirmation that all their hardships were not in vain, and they were moving in the right direction. Young Sineal, wrapping himself in his traveling cloak so that only his huge, full-of-longing eyes were visible, surveyed the lifeless, monotonous expanses with unconcealed despair. "Does anyone even live here, in this icy hell?" burst from him against his will, and his youthful voice, torn and distorted by the wind, sounded surprisingly plaintive, lost, and lonely. There's absolutely nothing here. Only cold and this eternal, cursed wind." Scarcely had these incautious, full of youthful despair words left his lips when the hippogriff leader, walking beside Lyrael in proud and silent posture, sharply, as if stumbling upon an invisible wall, stopped. He slowly, with incredible, predatory grace, turned his eagle, sharp-beaked head towards the young elf, and deep in his golden, intelligent eyes flared and burned a real fire, in which could be read not simple anger, but bitter, furious, hard-won knowledge. Then, not taking his piercing gaze off Sineal, he slowly, with demonstrative incredible force, reared. His powerful, scar-riddled wings rustled loudly, threateningly, unfolding to their full immense breadth, casting an enormous, sinister shadow on the ground, and his sturdy beak gaped in a mute, but incredibly expressive and terrible snarl. His whole posture, every tensed muscle, was not merely a warning of possible danger, it was an exhaustive, eloquent, and frightening answer. "Yes, someone lives here, and meeting them is this," said his entire body, frozen in a pose of purest, ancient, and merciless enmity. The silence that reigned after this mute but so loud performance was deafening, oppressive, full of unspoken horrors, "It seems our winged brother gave an exhaustive answer to your innocent question," Bo Aylar uttered grimly and doom-laden, not taking his stern, experienced gaze off the leader. And his words hung in the icy air. Lyrael slowly, heavily nodded, her own heart clenching into an icy lump, sensing ill. The hippogriff had not merely sensed some distant threat. He knew. He had seen this before. He was showing them the true, unadorned face of what inhabited these inhospitable wastes. And they, unknowing, were walking straight into its domain, towards that danger. And as if confirming their darkest guesses, on the very horizon, where the gray, low sky fused inseparably with the brown, dead earth, dark, angular, unnatural silhouettes loomed, at first unclear, blur, like a mirage. With each new step of the weary company they acquire ever clearer, ever more sinister outlines. These were not structures in the usual human or elven sense. What they saw were orc dwellings, crude pens and shelters, hastily cobbled together from dark, unplaned wood and huge, wine-bleached bones of some large animals. Crooked, pointed poles topped with jagged points and strips of rusty iron stuck from the ground like a palisade, and above them, like battle standards, tattered bywine animal hides flapped and dry. Empty skulls glinted in the light. Black, acrid, disgusting smoke rose from several low, stone-built hearths, and a gust of wind brought to them its nauseating smell, a thick, throat-coating mixture of soot, rotten meat, sweat, and something sharp, bestial, and primitively wild. The picture that opened to their shocked gazes was the living embodiment of decay, filth, and mute cruelty forcibly inscribed into the harsh but honest landscape of the wastes. It was not a fortress, not a settlement of reasoning beings, it was a lair, a place where only the most tenacious, the most merciless, and the most adapted to chaos survived. The hippogriff leader issued a low, growling, warning rumble, his gaze, full of old, as ancient mountains dash themselves, implacable hatred, fixed on the orc encampment, as if he saw through time all the battles that had raged here before. "Here is the answer," Lyrael said quietly, without a shadow of doubt, and in her voice was no fear. Not even surprise, only cold, heavy acceptance of the obvious and inevitable. "Orcs live here." Lyrael, with a sharp, honed gesture, ordered the whole company to drop behind the rear, scattered over the plain boulders that became their only, pitiful cover in this sea of emptiness. Cold, rough stone absorbed the last warmth of their bodies. She herself, pressed against one such stone, began attentively, with the cold fury of a hunter, to study the orc encampment, her sharp elven gaze seeking the slightest weak spots, breaches in its primitive but no less effective and deadly defense. "Straight on certain death," Aylar said quietly, and his words seemed to hang in the cold air, thick with the smell of smoke and damp earth. His gaze, sharp and weary, slid over the figures of orcs bustling between low, crooked huts. He saw the gleam of fire on their jagged armor, heard their hoarse, guttural speech filled with rough consonants. "There are too many of them, a whole tribe." "Then we go round," Lyrael answered just as quietly, almost in a whisper. By night, using the terrain, they lay until full dusk, pressed against the damp, frozen earth, watching as life in the encampment slowly died down, replaced by conversations around fires and the heavy, cloying smell of roasting flesh that tickled nostrils and caused slight nausea. With the onset of darkness, thick and velvety, they began to move, unhurried and calculated. Their path lay not straight, but on a wide arc skirting the settlement, and they used every fold of terrain, every gully in the soil, every stunted, dead bush as cover. And their hearts beat in their chests dully and anxiously, as if trying to break out. The hippogriffs became their main advantage, their silent guardian angels in this starless dark. The leader, majestic and silent, and several of the hardiest individuals soundlessly rose into the air, and the dark silhouettes of their powerful bodies merged with the night sky, becoming shadows among shadows. From bird flight height they watched the orc patrols, the dull spots of their torches, and gave the ground group soundless signals, a barely noticeable wingbeat, a barely audible, dry click of beak indicating the way between sleeping dangers. The elves moved like shadows born of the very night. Their steps, honed by millennia of life in forests, left no trace on the cracked, frozen earth. Every accidental creak of a twig underfoot, every rustle that escaped a stone screech made them freeze, pressing against the cold soil. And then they felt its damp chill through the thin fabric of their clothes, and heard only their own rapid breathing. They crawled along gullies whose slopes were strewn with sharp stones, dashed across open stretches, holding their breath when in the distance sounded the familiar, soul-freezing orc shout or the dull, hungry growl of a warg. The wind, their eternal enemy, relentless and penetrating, unexpectedly became an ally, its howling drowning the inevitable noise of their movement and carrying away to the side, away from the keen orc nostrils, possible smells of their bodies and skin. Lyrael laid them, and her own and typical foran elf instinct, heightened by long weeks of flight and dangers, caught the slightest signs of orc presence. A dropped arrow, a fresh boot print trampled into mud, a trampled food scrap. It was an exhausting, nerve-wracking confrontation, a battle of will attrition. They did not cross blades, did not loose arrows, but every meter of this path was a small victory wrested from the vigilance of a ferocious and countless enemy. And when the first, watery rays of morning dawn began slowly coloring the horizon the hue of dull iron and old blood, they were already far beyond the encampment, and only a thin, acrid trickle of smoke from orc fires, hanging in the air behind, reminded that they had passed literally under the nose of a whole tribe without raising alarm. The path east, to the secret of the fallen star, that mute mystery that drew them, was free again. But this freedom smelled not of freedom, but of weariness and cold sweat. They walked another whole day, delving deeper into the steppes, and the landscape around began slowly changing, as if adapting to their gloomy thoughts. The even, dreary plain overgrown with withered brown grass gradually gave way to hilly terrain dotted with dark, sullen rocky outcrops that reared from the earth like the bones of an ancient, dead giant. And now what moved them was not merely hope, that fragile and short-lived bird, but something greater, a certainty, heavy and undeniable as these very stones. Inside Lyrael, in the most hidden depths of her being, something strange and inevitable was happening. That very soundless hum that had pursued her from the very moment of leaving the sun-drenched groves of Lindorn was no longer merely the world's background noise, the earth's muttering underfoot. It had turned into a clear and inexorable call, pulsing in time with the blood's flow, distinct as the beat of her own heart. It hammered in her temples with an even, obsessive rhythm, insistently pulled her forward, like an invisible silk thread tied to her very soul and stretched to the limit. She no longer looked at the pale, cloud-hidden sun or the dimming night lights. She walked, obeying this internal compass, and her gaze, intent and unseeing, was fixed on a group of dark, blurred spots at the foot of the highest hill ahead, a hill that stood a lonely sentinel on this scorched earth. "She knows," old Halder said quietly, almost reverently, watching how she without a shadow of doubt or hesitation led them towards these rock formations. His own old knees ached from weariness, but he sought her straight back and forward-focused gaze. "Look at her. She hears the call of the stones." As they approached, step by step, the dark spots began to take shape, emerging from the morning mist. These were not mere heaps of stones thrown here by a glacier's whim or a tectonic shift. It was an intransegral yawning, black holes in the dark rock, resembling empty, blind eye sockets of a great giant. Caves. And her internal compass, this temple-pounding alarm, unmistakably and inexorably pointed straight at the largest, darkest, and most bottomless of these stone moss. They still took precautions, out of old habit, dropping and freezing at the sight of lone orc patrols with their shaggy, growling wargs. But now Lyrael felt not only the direction, but the heaviness emanating from the black entrance. The air around thickened, becoming viscous as pitch, filling with that same cooled, dead smell of stone tombs that came from the very depths, the smell of age-old dust, decay, and something ancient that should not have been disturbed. When they finally reached the foot of the hill, Lyrael stopped before the largest black maw of the cave. The pulsation inside her skull reached its peak, turning into a deafening, soundless roar filling her entire consciousness, displacing thoughts, leaving only one thing: the call. "Here," she exhaled, and her voice, usually ringing and clear, was now hoarse from internal tension and weariness. She raised her hand, and her fingers trembled, pointing into the black, cold darkness lying beyond the stone threshold, a darkness that seemed not merely to absorb light but to devour it. "Inside. It is here. The secret of the fallen star, the secret for which they had laid so many days of travel, awaited them not under the earth but in these stone depths, in this cold mountain's belly." And everything in her being, every cell of her body, every beat of her elven heart screamed to her that they had found, at last, what they had so long sought, and that now there would be no way back. Lyrael turned sharply to the hippogriffs. Her internal compass beat furiously in her temples, insistent and imperious, but now its voice, pure and clear, overrode another, more ancient and troubling instinct whispering of traps and stone tombs. "You need to hide." Her voice sounded urgent. In it heard were steel notes of command born not of authority, of knowledge. She looked straight at the leader, into his intelligent, golden eyes, in which was reflected the same, guiding them darkness. "In the caves you cannot maneuver. Wings will become your cage. Take cover among the cliffs, amid these boulders and fissures." The wise leader gave a short nod with his eagle visage and issued an abrupt, guttural cry understandable only to his kin. His flock, disciplined and mute, immediately began to retreat from the sinister entrance, their powerful bodies deftly dissolving among the jumble of dark boulders and deep fissures, as if they had never been. It was at this very moment, when the last hippogriff vanished from sight, that Rinale, whose gaze, tearing away from the beckoning darkness of the cave, was by sentinel habit fixed on the bleak horizon, gasped, short and frightened, and sharply pointed her hand in the direction from which they had come. "Look!" burst from her. And in that one word sounded such horror and despair that the blood in the veins of each remaining elf froze instantly. From there, from the quivering mirage distance, rose a dark, dense mass resembling a storm cloud pressed to the very earth. An orc patrol. 30, maybe 40 figures, rushing across the plain with relentless, dull determination. Dust, gray and suffocating, billowed from under their crooked feet and from under the broad, shaggy paws of their wargs, rising in the windless air a pillar visible for many miles. They did not weave, did not bow heads to the ground seeking tracks. They walked straight, like an arrow loosed from a taut bow, straight towards the group of caves, towards this lonely, sinister hill. "They are coming here," whispered old Halder, and in his voice, usually firm as steel, was heard a heavy, aged weariness, as if he had seen this dream in reality and knew how it would end. Liriel swallowed, feeling her throat go dry from dust and fear she did not allow herself to show. "We could not have been seen, otherwise they would have attacked earlier, from ambush," she said quietly, and her words were addressed more to herself and to her companions, as if testing the course of her own thoughts for strength. "They are walking by the same call as I, feel the same heaviness in the air, the same beating in the blood." And in this admission was a bitter, soul-freezing clarity. They were not the only ones here. They had no time for reflection, not a moment for arguments or fear that luxury had remained somewhere far behind, in other, safer days. The orcs were already close, so close that individual figures, the crooked contours of their silhouettes against the bleak sky, the gleam of jagged weapons, dully glinting like rotten teeth in the open maws of wargs, could be distinguished. "Into the cave," commanded Liriel, and in her voice, usually restrained, rang steel notes brooking no argument, notes forged of desperation and responsibility. Quickly, before they blocked the entrance, the elves, like gray shadows, broke from their spot and rushed into the black, yawning gap of the largest entrance, into this stone belly ready to swallow them, trading one threat visible and tangible for another. Dark and unknown, Aylar entered last, turning for a moment towards the last reflection of the cold day. The stone gloom, thick and almost tangible as damp wool, swallowed them, instantly cutting off the external world with its sun, wind, and the advancing, trampling death. They pressed against the cold, rough, slimy moss-covered walls right at the entrance, holding their breath, and from outside, as if through a thick wall, came to them the heavy, staccato tramp of dozens of feet, the dull, hungry growling of wargs that froze blood, and hoarse, guttural cries full of impatience and malice, like the barking of enraged hounds, hiding in the cold, damp darkness saturated with the smell of age-old dust and dampness. The elves, like a single being with many ears, listened to every sound from outside, to every rustle, every nerve taut as a bowstring. The coarse, abrupt voices of orcs, the clang of weapons against metal armor fastenings, and the heavy, snorting, hoarse breathing of wargs filled the air at the cave entrance, creating a deafening, discordant cacophony of pure, undiluted threat. Suddenly heavy, confident, measured steps, dully echoing off stone, sounded very close, and in the opening, flooded with the dull, dusty light of the wastes, appeared, blocking it with itself, a single massive, stocky figure whose shadow fell far into the grotto. He was larger than the others, noticeably broader in the shoulders, and his body, mighty and sinewy, was clad in armor of roughly tanned, thick leather, covered with jagged edges, rusty rivets, and dark, clotted stains in which former blood could be guessed. A huge, two-handed axe in his hands, with a broad, dull blade, cast a long, grotesquely distorted shadow on the uneven wall. He carried no torch, relying on his narrow, yellow eyes accustomed to the half-dark of dungeons and night skirmishes. Those eyes from under a heavy, overhanging brow slowly and methodically, with animal, predatory thoroughness, studied the entrance part of the grotto, sliding over every outcrop, every crack, every dark corner. The other orcs remained outside, their audible, overlapping voices and the impatient, angry growling of wargs clearly indicating they had not gone anywhere but merely posted sentries, encircling the hill's foot with a dense, vigilant ring. "Perhaps we attack," Fëanor uttered barely audibly, only moving his lips so the words more resembled an exhalation. His long, slender, elegant fingers gripped the hilt of his blade so hard the knuckles whitened, standing out under the skin like small stones. "He is alone. We could be quick, quiet." "No." Lyriel interrupted him without the slightest hesitation, sharply, almost roughly. Her whisper was burning quiet and imperious, leaving no room for discussion. "Any sound, clang, groan, even a stifled moan, and they will all, as one, burst in here. They will slaughter us right on this spot, not letting us take a step inward, and our blood will water this threshold." And in her words was no fear, only cold, merciless calculation. The calculation of a commander weighing chances and understanding those chances were zero. She watched intently, unwaveringly, the lone orc, absorbing his every movement, every turn of the head, every gesture of his coarse, calloused hands. He, it seemed, did not suspect their presence, did not scent their smell mingled with the smell of stone, dampness, and their own, acrid fear hiding in the shadows. He sniffed the air, widely inhaling the heavy, stagnant, musty air of the cave with his nostrils, ran his broad, scarred and filthy palm over the rough walls, as if following an invisible, known only to him trail, reading the stone's history with his fingers. He behaved not like a scout checking a shelter's safety for enemies or traps, but like they themselves had only minutes ago, like a seeker, like one who is led by something greater than mere sight or hearing. His movements were full of that same concentrated, almost ritualistic purposefulness. "He is not here without reason," Lyriel continued quietly, still watching his every gesture. "He feels the same as I, the same call, the same pulsation. He goes to the source, straight to it." She exchanged long, meaningful looks with Aelor and Halder, seeing in their eyes, wide with strain, the same, sudden understanding. They were not the only travelers drawn to this place. They were hunters, who had come upon the same trail as another, far more terrible beast. "We will follow him." Lyriel made the decision, and in her voice was no hesitation, only cold resolve. "Without nose, like shadows, we will learn where he goes. Perhaps he, and knowing, will lead us straight to what we seek, and we will not have to wander in the dark, by feel." They detached from the cold, damp wall and, like ghosts born of the very darkness, moved deeper into the cave, keeping a respectful, lethally dangerous distance from the lone orc. The shadow of their invisible, mute pursuit closed over them, swallowing the last reflections of day, and only the heavy, confident steps of the creature ahead, beating a measured, sinister rhythm, led them into the very heart of the mystery. On this strange, ill-omened journey, the orc, without looking back, with dull, relentless confidence moved deeper into the cave, into the thickening gloom. His heavy, measured steps, dully echoing in the low stone passages, were like a drumbeat masking the soundless, ghostly movement of the elves. They followed him like shadows. Their light steps produced no sound, their clothes did not rustle, their breathing was as quiet as the rustle of a cobweb. The air in the cave, at first cold and damp, gradually grew warmer, more humid, and ahead, in the heart of the stone labyrinth, began to spread a strange, flickering, phosphorescent light that made hearts contract. Soon the tunnel, until then straight and narrow, forked, diverging into two black, yawning mouths. The orc, without hesitating an instant, turned into the left branch. Precisely from there, winding along the walls, flowed that same unearthly, cold light casting long, distorted shadows. He paused for a moment at the entrance, his mighty, stocky figure momentarily completely blocking the source of radiance, casting a thick, black shadow on the pursuers, then, without looking back, stepped inside, dissolving in the glow. Lyriel stopped the company with a sharp, abrupt gesture. They pressed against the rough, damp wall right at the turn, hidden by deep, impenetrable shadows cast by the strange light. She slowly, with utmost caution, afraid to disturb even the stone with her breath, peered around the corner. What she saw made her breath catch and her heart stop in her chest as if from a blow. The cave widened into a vast, high grotto flooded with cold, phosphorescent light emanating from the very walls and ceiling, as if the stone were saturated with moonlight through and through. The stone here was not merely smooth, it was as if polished over centuries by some unknown, mighty force, polished to a mirror-like, sterile gleam, and emitted an even, lifeless, ghostly glow in which there was neither warmth nor comfort. In the very center of the grotto, crossing his powerful, vein-corded legs, kneeling like a stone idol, sat an orc. But this was no ordinary warrior whose body could be shattered by steel, and spirit by fear. His armor, if it could be called armor, resembled congealed night mist. Only deceptively repeating the outlines of an orcish hauberk, it shimmered like a mirage, at times losing clarity and blurring, to a moment later regain form woven of shadow and moonlight. His skin, usually earthy gray or putrid green in his kin, here under the grotto's ghostly glow seemed pale, almost transparent, like ash from a long-extinguished fire, through which could be guessed the outlines not of bones, but of some other, more ancient substance. The features remained coarse, recognizably orcish, massive jaw, tusks protruding from under thick lips, but they were frozen in a kind of timeless repose, like the face of a stone statue carved in an era when the world was still young, and the deep-set eyes, devoid of luster, stared into the emptiness before him with a bottomless, stone wisdom in which all thought and all feeling had been extinguished. From him emanated an almost tangible aura of antiquity, not merely long life, but genuine, titanic eternity, or ringing silence in which could be heard the unhurried, indifferent passage of millennia. The orc who had entered, standing before him, breathing, sweaty and alive, seemed pitiful, ephemeral, and incredibly young in comparison to this frozen, soulless might. He lowered his jagged axe, and his ferocious, scar-covered face contorted in a grimace in which instinctive, habitual fury fought with timid incomprehension bordering on superstitious, animal fear. He slowly, almost against his own will, stretched out a hand, its calloused fingers trembling in the air, not daring to touch this own living flesh, afraid to defile it or be defiled. Lyrael, watching from the shadow of the passage, felt her own internal call. This obsessive pulsation in her temples that had guided her so many days suddenly fall silent, absorbed and suppressed by the absolute, all-consuming muteness emanating from the sitting orc idol. The being and the orc continued their dialogue, indistinguishable to her ears and comprehensible only to the two of them. Lyrael could not make out a single word, but saw how the posture of the one who had entered changed from wary and ready to strike to attentive, like a pupil before a teacher, then to submissive, almost slavish. Finally, the orc said something, his guttural, short words absorbed by the grotto's strange acoustics, and gave a short, soldierly nod of his large head, as if agreeing to some order or concluding a bargain. And in that same instant the space around them shuddered, though the stone underfoot remained motionless. The air rippled, streamed, as if overheated stones on a sultry noon, distorting the outlines of figures. From the sitting being, slowly and inexorably, a wave of invisible force, and forth first an enveloping, almost womb-like warm smelling of the dust of ancient tombs, which immediately gave way to a bone-penetrating cold of eternal frost, making Lyrael shudder and clench her teeth even hidden in her refuge. But this was only the beginning, a quiet harbinger of a miracle. The ghostly, smoky form of the ancient orc shuddered and flowed, like thick tar, towards the standing chieftain. He froze, his body suddenly arched in a painful, unnatural spasm. As to essences, the living and that which was beyond life began to merge into one new, monstrous form. This was not absorption, it was interweaving, repulsive and majestic, where the ashen, translucent flesh of the ancient spirit wove into the living, mighty muscles and strong bones of the living warrior, filling them with strength accumulated over centuries. Before her eyes the orc transformed, stretching and densifying. His already mighty frame became even more massive, broader in the shoulders. Muscles swelled like overfilled bellows under the skin, which took on a dark, almost black, metallic hue like volcanic glass. But the most dreadful were his eyes. They went dark, then filled with an even crimson light, like coals heated to redness, in which remained nothing of the former, albeit ferocious, animal mind, only cold, impersonal, titanic might devoid of thought and mercy. From his figure emanated a sinister, pulsing in time with this merging radiance, a halo of distorted, black magic that illuminated the whole grotto for one blinding instant, and just as suddenly, extinguished, drawn back into the newborn, monstrous form, as if the darkness itself had inhaled it. The process was complete. In the place of two beings, the living and the ancient, remained a single one. The orc, transformed and filled to the brim with alien strength, stood in the same posture, but was now a completely different being. From him now wafted not merely a warrior's strength, but concentrated fury clad in living, tempered flesh, ready for destruction. The transformed orc turned and moved back the same way he had come. His gait was not merely heavy, it was inexorable, like the movement of a glacier crushing cliffs, or a tectonic plate rising from the depths. From him no longer emanated that dazzling radiance that had illuminated the grotto during the merging, but the aura of ancient, titanic and indifferent bite surrounding him was almost tangible, oppressive to consciousness. It seemed the very step, its icy wind, its silence and its despair, had condensed into this single figure. The elves, holding their breath, recoiled deeper into a side fissure, pressing into the cold, rough stone, feeling its damp coolness through their clothes. They dared not follow him, dared not even stir or draw breath until those heavy, measured, fateful steps died away in the distant, dark passages, dissolving in muteness. The silence that reigned after his departure was deafening, thick and heavy as lead. It lasted only a few moments, then from outside, from around the tunnel bend, came a thunderous, guttural exclamation. It was not merely a cry, it was a call born in the very depths of a corrupted soul, full of such primordial force and triumphant, reckless might that it seemed to issue not from a mortal creature's throat, but from the very throat of the steppe. It rolled in a low, threatening echo through the stone labyrinths, making ancient dust on the vaults shudder, and burst outside, spreading over the silent, cold plains. Other voices followed, dozens of hoarse, furious throats taking up this call, but now in them could be heard not merely blind malice, but a frenzied, almost religious, wild exultation, a psalm glorifying the birth of a new god of destruction. Lirael, with a sharp, commanding gesture, held the company in place, pressing a palm to the air. They sat in complete, almost tomb-like darkness a long while more, that seemed an eternity, listening to every rustle, every echo from outside. The cries gradually subsided, replaced by a measured, organized, receding tramp of many feet. The whole orc tribe, inspired, was leaving. When the last sounds died away and from outside came nothing but the familiar, mournful howling of wind in the cliffs, they, as if on command, cautiously, one by one, emerged from their hiding place and, crouching, with utmost wariness, peered out from the black maw of the cave. The steppe lay before them deserted, silent and motionless under the low, leaden sky. Not a single living soul. Only gusty, cold wind drove a prickly ground blizzard over the frozen, cracked earth, covering, as if ashamed, the last traces of recent presence. The trail was gone. They stood on the stone threshold of the cave, feeling under their feet the rough, cold stone, and gazed at the endless, dreary gray plain flooded with pale, joyless light. The enemies had gone, dissolving in the quivering mirage of the horizon, but in the stagnant, cold air hung an awareness far more terrible and inevitable. The one who had emerged from the stone bowels was not merely an orc, one of many. He had transformed, becoming a vessel for something ancient and dreadful, and now this new, unknown horror, born in the stone womb, had entered the wide world. And none of them, elves who had seen various wonders and abominations in their time, could even guess what dark purpose he pursued and what storm he brought with him on his powerful shoulders. Scarcely had they stepped from the damp gloom of the cave into the bleak, cold light went from the sky, with a quiet rustle like the sound of wind in dry grass. Shadows descended soundlessly. The hippogriffs, sensing the immediate threat had passed, returned to their companions, driven by loyalty stronger than fear. They uttered no sound, no cry, no click of beak. Only their powerful wings rustled quietly with feathers as they settled on the frozen, cracked earth, and their hot breath swirled white steam in the cold air. The leader, majestic and silent, strode heavily towards Lirael and inclined his eagle head, peering into her eyes with his piercing, golden gaze. In his deep, intelligent, almost human gaze could be read a mute but distinct question. What now? Where lies our path? Lirael met his gaze, and in her own, usually clear eyes stood an emptiness far deeper and more bottomless than in the cave behind. She slowly, almost hopelessly, shook her head, and thin strands of her silver hair stir in the wind. He is gone, she whispered, addressing more herself than the others, and her voice sounded hoarse and weary. That call, that hum that guided me from the very beginning, that hammered in my temples like an alarm. It has ceased, fallen silent. Now there is only silence there. She shifted her gaze, heavy and clouded, to the dark, yawning maw of the cave from which the bearer of ancient, titanic horror had just emerged. We have found what we were looking for, or rather, what remained of it, she continued, and each word came to her with effort. That was the first fallen star, not a stone, not light from the heavens, but this essence. It did not perish, did not turn to dust, it changed, bided its time, and broke free. She pressed her temples with long, slender fingers, and her face, pale and refined, contorted with agonizing, unbearable clarity descending upon her like revelation. We must carry this news to Lindorn, now, immediately. Quendel must know of this. He must know that the falling of stars was not an end, not simple death of lights, but a beginning. The beginning of something we do not understand. We need to understand what to do next, before it is too late, before this shadow spreads over the whole world. The decision was made, and in her voice rang steely resolve, brooking no argument. There was no other way. No other options remained. The hippogriffs, these faithful, mighty companions whose fates had intertwined with the elven ones in the crucible of common trouble, were already lining up, impatiently shifting from foot to foot, ready to become their wings again, their salvation and their weapon. Without superfluous words, with practiced movements of weary but unbroken warriors, the elves mounted their broad, densely feathered backs. This time there was no fear of height, only cold, desperate resolve to do what must be done. With a powerful, elastic beat of huge wings raising clouds of dust, they tore themselves from the inhospitable, dead earth of the northern steppes. The air current, icy and sharp as a dagger blow, struck their faces, creaking underclothes, but they barely felt it, numb from the weight of the truth revealed to them. The return journey took far less time, for both hippogriffs and elves had almost fully recovered from old wounds and exhaustion, and now their movement resembled a swift, well-oiled march knowing no obstacles. The company raced west, towards the familiar, majestic outlines of the Dragon's Ridge, leaving behind the sinister, oppressive emptiness of the lands where a star had fallen and been reborn in new guise. They stopped only for short respites and anxious overnight halts, to give rest to muscles trembling from long strain, and to share meager, monotonous food, bitter roots and wild berries found in the stony foothills. But even these brief halts were devoid of the former, oppressive hopelessness. Now there was a goal, clear and terrible. A quick, silent meal, a few hours of anxious, fitful sleep under the watch of alternating sentries, and again on the way. Along the cold and indifferent mountains, the hippogriffs, whose wings had regained their former, titanic might, carried them high above the earth where the air was thin and cold. At first they flew through the giant, ancient rift where the cliff walls of the Dragon's Ridge reared on both sides, like stone giants lifting their hoary peaks to the sky. Then their path lay along the southern, gentler foothills, past that very place where not so long ago it had been on the brink of doom, a stone ledge, where the furious, desperate battle with Harpies had unfolded. From bird flight height the traces of that long-ago fight were still visible, fragments of cliffs torn off by sharp, steel-like claws, and dark, stone-grain stains reminiscent of spilled blood. The wind, once their enemy, fierce and unpredictable, was now favorable, driving them homeward as if fate itself hurried them. The elves sat silently, motionless on the hippogriffs' backs, peering at the emerging in the distance outlines of the western ranges. Their gazes were fixed on the line of the horizon where the familiar, warm stripe of the eternal forest had already begun to appear, a dark green, living mass promising peace, rest, and safety. But no old songs, no comforting conversations broke the oppressive silence of their flight. The weight of what they had seen in the cave, and of the news they carried with them, hung in the air, thicker and more tangible than weariness itself, heavier than any armor. With each beat of the mighty, tireless wings the native, familiar two-tiers places grew ever closer and more distinct. Already the winding, silver bends of the Arundel, originating from the snowy mountain slopes, could be distinguished, and the calm, mirror-like gleam of lakes lying in green valleys. The air, once cold and thin, gradually filled with familiar, dear to the hearts and spine, damp moss, flowering meadows, and damp earth. But instead of the joy of return, instead of relief, the elves felt only heavy, oppressive anxiety. They carried with them not good news, not a tale of victory, but a warning of an approaching, unprecedented storm. And on how they delivered this news now depended too much, if not everything. When the first, majestic trees of Lindorn, ancient as the world itself, appeared beneath them, the hippogriffs slowed their swift flight, smoothly and silently gliding between the crowns of centuries-old oaks and pines. The air, imbued with familiar, sweet aromas of pine needles, flowering herbs, and tree resin, should have brought peace to weary souls. But today, only with new force emphasized the weight of their mission, the contrast between the peaceful beauty of home and the gloom they had brought from the east. They landed on the familiar outskirts of the bright grove where the white tree, titanic and beautiful, stretched its branches, like arms, towards the sky. The moment of parting, bitter and inevitable, had come. The hippogriff leader issued a furious, guttural cry full of wild strength and longing, which was immediately taken up by his entire flock, not threatening, but full of might and mute promise of loyalty. Then the mighty, proud creatures approached their companions one by one, inclining their large, eagle heads for a last, brief farewell. Lyriel embraced the leader's neck, feeling under her palms the warm, resilient skin and the powerful, playing muscles beneath. "Thank you, children of the sky. How to find you if aid is needed again?" she asked quietly, almost whispering, looking into the bottomless, golden eyes of the hippogriff, in which her own weary face was reflected. The leader nudged her shoulder with his sharp, curved beak, softly and carefully, then sharply threw his head back to the sky pierced by the rays of the setting sun, and issued a short, piercing, recognizable among 1,000 cry that echoed pure and clear throughout the sleeping forest. It seemed this sound would remain forever in the elves' memory. Their call, should the hour come, would be heard. Having said farewell, the hippogriffs one by one, with a powerful nose of wings, rose into the cool evening air. Their huge shadows slid over the green tree crowns and vanished in the direction from which they had all flown together, to the east. The elves silently, unable to utter a word, watched them go, then, as if on command, turned towards the white tree shining in the rays of sunset. At its ancient, rune-inscribed roots Quendel was already waiting for them. His face, usually calm and wise as the sea itself, was tense, and in his eyes, which had seen much in his time, could be read mute expectation and quiet anxiety. "Well," the old elf said quietly, without preamble, and his voice sounded loud and distinct in the ensuing silence. "Tell me what you found there, in the east, in those empty and silent lands." Lyriel took a deep breath full of the air of her native forest, gathering her thoughts to clothe the inexpressible horror in words. "We found not the death of a star," she began, and each of her sounds fell into the grave-like silence like a stone into water. "We found its awakening, and it has already begun its journey." Thank you for your attention. Please like and subscribe so you don't miss the next part and chapter.